Hello everyone, and welcome to the second part of my love letter to Toy Story 3 in celebration of the film's 15th anniversary. For those just joining us, I strongly recommend watching part 1 so you have full context for future points I will be making, but for the rest of us, let's get this wagon train a-moving. We last left off with Woody having made the decision to return home while leaving his friends to stay at Sunnyside, leading into his quest to leave the daycare without being detected, which may, at first, seem like a mundane place to continue our adventure through this movie following the heartbreaking emotional fallout of the last part. It appears to just be an action sequence that allows Woody to escape and subsequently encounter another speed bump on his journey back to Andy, but while it might not seem so at first, this is actually one of the most crucial parts of the entire film. Offering up a bit of exciting action and tension is certainly part of why it's in the movie, but it also serves a much more significant role in regards to the wider plot because one of the most common questions about Toy Story 3 I see get floated around is, if Woody is able to leave Sunnyside without much resistance from anyone or anything beyond the average everyday obstacles a toy encounters, then why don't the toys just escape during the day when Lotso's guards don't have the run of the place? And that is a very astute question to ask, but it's also one which this entire sequence exists to answer. Because yes, Woody escapes Sunnyside without ever crossing paths with anyone from Lotso's gang, never being the wiser that this daycare is secretly a hellscape prison for any toys trapped in the caterpillar room. And that was the ultimate challenge of creating this scene, that Woody needed to escape in a logical and visually entertaining way, but they also couldn't utilize any prison-themed obstacles yet because they didn't want to pull back the curtain on Sunnyside's Heart of Darkness so early in the movie. And if it's easy for Woody, then yeah, toys could just leave during the day, but what you have to keep in mind is that it's a lot easier for a toy to navigate this facility undetected on their own than it is to transport an entire group of toys, especially one as massive as this and one with as much anatomical diversity. Can you imagine Rex, Ham, or the aliens performing all the tricks that Woody did to get out of here? Absolutely nothing about this escape would be in any way reproducible for every single toy. Woody would not have been able to escape Sunnyside at all if he had to tag along with a team during this sequence. And more importantly,
you think that was easy?
Was it easy?
Woody might make things look easy because of how competent he is at staying under the radar, and that he's quite agile and expeditious with his movements, but also cautious, like with how he checks to make sure the janitor isn't looking his way before starting to sneak out the window, or waiting until Bonnie and her mom are out of sight before continuing to move along the railing of the building. But truthfully, this scene demonstrates that it is incredibly difficult for Woody to get out of this place, and that a big reason he was able to do so in a way that appeared effortless to you is because he got extremely lucky. He got lucky, for instance, that there was a smudge on the mirror in the perfect position such that the janitor wouldn't see him when he glanced up at it. He also got lucky that there was a kite abandoned on the roof of the daycare he could use to soar over the playground. That being said, considering how absolutely disgusting most public restrooms are, I'm actually surprised there aren't more smudges of this caliber decorating the mirror, and of all things to find on top of a building, especially one where lots of kids will be running around on a daily basis, a kite isn't the most unlikely thing you could find there. But there is no denying that this is, without question, the single luckiest part of the entire movie. However, because the things that allow Woody to escape are so incredibly convenient for him, what that communicates to the audience is that the only way a toy could realistically escape Sunnyside during the daytime is through sheer unbridled luck, and thus making it such that this is in no way a consistent avenue of escape the toys could use to their advantage, as opposed to simply a case of, oh boy, it sure was lucky things worked out for this character, and that being the entire summation of its role in the narrative. The writers leverage these acts of contrivance for the benefit of the story as a whole.
I made it out once.
You got lucky once.
And while this escape scene is busy laying down the foundations for the major conflicts later in the film, and making sure Bonnie's still present in your mind, it also manages to be highly entertaining in the moment without you having to think about any of that. It's 2 minutes of Woody showing off his skills, chock full of bouncy and energetic animation, spectacular stunts, and hygiene, because it's always been a real pet peeve of mine whenever I see people in movies or TV carelessly grab onto toilet bowls and then run away or play with their fucking hair before washing their hands without a care in the world. Yes, I'm one of those weird clean freak people, ooh. Also, since I see this get brought up a lot, and I mean a lot, no, it is not a problem that none of the humans see Woody flying over them with the kite. This makes complete and total sense, and I will tell you why, because when I was that age, the only thing I cared about when I was on a playground was zipping down the slides, flying high on the swings, and generally just messing around with my friends. And I can tell you from testimony of people I know who were or are teachers, the only thing they're focused on in these situations is supervising the kids to make sure nobody does anything stupid. And even if one of the kids did happen to catch a glimpse of him, like perhaps this girl while going upward on the swing, thus giving her a perfect vantage point to spot Woody, they wouldn't have any reason to suspect this is anything other than a kite flying or an all-in-one glider toy or something to that effect. It's kind of a similar situation to the climax of the first movie. Obviously, there's no way in the world the drivers didn't see Woody and Buzz blasting down the road strapped to a rocket. But let me ask you a question. If you were one of these people, and you happened to see this, what would you conclude? Let's say it's bright and early in the morning. You just dragged yourself out of bed and gotten all dressed up, hopped in your car, ready for another super exciting day at wherever you're going, and then all of a sudden you see this thing come screaming past you. Are you going to think, oh my goodness, the toys are alive and they're flying themselves on a rocket? No, of course not. No reasonable person would ever immediately leap to that conclusion. What you would probably think is something along the lines of, these damn kids are getting more irresponsible with these toys every year. See, back in my day, and if you were a kid on this playground and you did by chance happen to see Woody for a moment, you probably either wouldn't think much of it or you'd think it was cool to see and then you'd go right back to pushing little Billy down the slide because he was too slow. Little shit. It is a bit lame that Woody's escape is foiled by a random gust of wind, but I suppose the wind does blow in mysterious ways sometimes. Plus, they do kinda counterbalance that contrivance by justifying how Woody survives such a crazy fall, as aside from being a ragdoll far more capable of taking some hits than a toy like Buzz Lightyear, who we've seen break from even lesser heights, you can also hear him hit the leaves to cushion his landing before he starts bonking around the branches. And then they also justify why his string doesn't just snap after tugging on the tree, because if you look closely, you can see Woody's string doesn't leave his body until he begins his final descent toward the sidewalk. And I'm pretty sure his string has been able to take way more abuse than that in the past without getting ripped out. Outtakes don't count. God, I miss those. But perhaps the most important part of this sequence is how seamlessly they interweave Bonnie and Woody's actions throughout it. They took the time to make sure you wouldn't forget who she was or what she looked like when they first arrived at Sunnyside, and then progressed her and Woody's stories simultaneously by having Woody leave the caterpillar room because Bonnie's mom was trying to find her to pick her up and go home, which put these two characters on the same pace for when they were starting to leave Sunnyside, making it believable that Bonnie would bump into him on her way out to the car, and it wasn't a complete coincidence that she found him hanging up in that tree. Plus, her roaming around the daycare trying to keep her mind busy while her mom was finishing up work for the day is exactly what I would do when my mom was a substitute teacher from my school, and I had to wait for her to finish proctoring the pickup car line before we could go home. There's so much else to be said about Bonnie's role in the story, but we'll have to save that for just a little bit later, because back over in the caterpillar room with the other toys, recess is coming to an end, and all the kids are hurriedly lining up outside the classroom door, which means that bell's about to ring and it's almost time for the toys to get the playtime they've been dreaming of. Or at least, that's what they think is going to happen, but the sight of all the resident Sunnyside toys scurrying out of the danger zone and cowering under any form of cover they can find starts setting off alarm bells in Buzz's head, and before he gets the chance to warn anyone... Look, even though this doesn't make any sense at all because we know Buzz needs to push these purple buttons to open and close his helmet, I still love the joke of it automatically closing out of fear from seeing the toddler stampede barreling towards him. I'm willing to give a pass to breaches in logic if they're in service of a joke, so long as they don't significantly affect the wider plot by proxy. There will be more instances of this type of thing later on in the movie, and we've already seen one during their initial arrival when a part of Potato Head's arm went limp for no logical reason other than to make you laugh, and to call back to his pitiful arm arm strength in the first movie, which I greatly appreciate. There are certainly instances where writers will absent-mindedly include something because they think it's funny, only for that thing to have massive ripple effects elsewhere in the script that harm its structural integrity.
So Buzz here, this is continuing the joke of his inner voice.
But this isn't one of them, because nothing about Buzz's helmet closing like this has an impact on how the plot unfolds moving forward. Now, my friends, I do have something of a confession to make. I fervently refused to watch this scene as a kid. No joke, I have vivid memories of being in Auditorium 16 of that movie theater in summer of 2010, and suddenly having an urge to run to the restroom during Woody's departure from Sunnyside because I knew the rough play was gonna happen from watching the trailers, and structurally, I had a sickening feeling in my gut it was coming up real soon. I was legitimately too scared to watch the toys get utterly eviscerated by these toddlers. It actually did deeply upset me, and even still to this day, I can feel some of those same butterflies rumbling around in my stomach during the build-up to those doors being flung open. But now that I'm an adult and can actually watch this scene without passing out, I understand why it made me feel the way that it did when I was a kid and can appreciate it for those reasons. Because sure, not everyone was a scared little baby to the extent that I was, but I know I'm not the only one who didn't like watching this scene, and it's because of how well it's constructed. The warm and inviting color palette from the introduction to Sunnyside is completely gone, replaced instead with a hideous and much colder fluorescent lighting scheme reminiscent of a doctor's office. The music feels chaotic, with the orchestra kicked up to 11 and the piano especially going off the rails. The camera movement is frantic, constantly zipping back and forth across the room, and it's always kept low to the ground so that these toddlers who could otherwise be knocked over by just sneezing on them look like humongous monsters, terrorizing the citizens beneath them. Not to mention, it's just kinda gross. All of this manages to communicate a sense of danger for the toys without it actually feeling like you're watching some kind of Saw-like torture scene, unless you're me at 7 years old. In fact, it's actually funny watching the toddlers be practically framed as rampaging dinosaurs, dumping glitter all over Ham or using Jessie as a paintbrush, but you still understand that for them, it's miserable. And it's also a testament to how far we've come since the first film, where all the Caterpillar Room kids are uniquely designed and modeled rather than being an army of Andy clones. Now, another issue I've seen a lot of people raise is that this rough play scene is an irresponsibly inaccurate depiction of what it's like at daycare, painting teachers and childcare workers in a negative light by having them allow these kids to run rampant and just yeet toys across the room. I could respond to this criticism by appealing to my own personal experience in school, and that it is not even remotely a stretch that the kids would be allowed to run amok as they play with their toys. I could appeal to that anecdote, or I could just play this clip from the director's commentary.
For a long time I felt bad, like, well, okay, there's no preschool that's really like this, because the teachers would have the kids under control. But I was actually at a weekend event at my kid's preschool, and something like that actually happened. The kids were just running around like crazy, and they were driving over toys with their tricycles out in the playground, and so it was nice to see that there was some reality to the kind of the craziness of the scene that we were creating for the movie.
And our kids are younger. They're little kids, too. That's the intention of that. They don't know how to play nice.
Right, the little kids who are in the Caterpillar Room.
I rest my case.
Oh, and by far the strangest thing I've seen people say about this scene is that framing these kids as if they're the devil is hypocritical, because this is the same way Andy played with his toys, yet he's glamorized like a god while the Sunnyside kids are demonized. Which is just patently untrue. They openly acknowledge how inappropriate it was for Mr. Potato Head to be played with by someone around Molly's age.
Ages 3 and up. It's on my box. Ages 3 and up. I'm not supposed to be babysitting Princess Drool.
And for Andy himself, it's true that he does knock some toys around as the bad guys in his stories, but he never deals actual damage to them, and if he thinks there's a risk of such a thing happening, like if you remember in the opening scene with the spaceship in the sky, then he's shown to take measures to prevent that. When he accidentally rips Woody's arm, he immediately snaps out of his fantasy playtime because of how concerned and upset he is at what he's just done, which is nothing compared to what the daycare kids do to these toys. So to claim these two styles of play are synonymous with each other is hilarious, when the main purpose of this scene is to demonstrate that their playtime is the exact opposite from how we saw Andy play with his toys in every previous movie, including the beginning of this one, as well as the opposite of how Lotso and his crew are being played with over in the Butterfly Room. But the rough play does serve another purpose, which is to set up
Move over, Mr. Prickle Pants. We have a guest.
Bonnie's Playtime, a brief but essential part of the movie that fulfills 3 writing objectives. It primarily acts as an unfortunate bump in the road on Woody's quest to get back to Andy before he leaves for college, but it also serves as a crystal clear juxtaposition to the hell the toys are currently going through over at Sunnyside, which also helps tee up the third and most important reason this scene exists, which is to show you how loving and caring Bonnie is with her toys. She's immediately lovable, funny, and generally engaging to watch, serving as a complimentary counterpart to her earlier introduction, as out in the world she acts incredibly shy and tends to keep to herself, but the second she gets home to a private, sacred, and protected place she knows well, she can let her true personality explode and start bouncing off the walls, unleashing that boundless energy and imagination she can't tap into anywhere else. Playing with a sense of unbridled youthful exuberance, cherishing and respecting every single one of her toys, so that when Woody makes his final choice at the end of the movie, it feels completely earned and justified that this would become the toy's new home. But they can't go too far with it. They can't make this playtime sequence seem too perfect or in any way present this place as a solution to all of Woody's problems, because that would give away the biggest emotional gut punch reveal of the third act. So to prevent that from happening, they have to actually create more problems for Woody by delaying him from returning to Andy, and they make it such that Bonnie herself isn't even really the main focus of the scene. She feels like a background obstacle that occasionally inconveniences Woody's desperate attempts to obtain any information about where he is from the other toys every time she runs back into the room. And this new group of toys has a very different dynamic from the ones who lived in Andy's room, with these guys behaving more like a casual improvisational acting troupe than the industrial office worker environment complete with actual staff meetings cultivated under Woody's leadership. Which is great because they could have easily slipped into writing the same archetype we're already familiar with, but the truth is that not every kid's room would be the same, so they chose to write something unique for Bonnie's toys to make it feel fresh for those who'd been with the series for all these years. With Buttercup being super overdramatic when talking to Woody about how he could get out of there.
There is no way out!
Mr. Pricklepants being visibly distraught at someone ruining his picture-perfect, Oscar-worthy performance. And Dolly giving Woody the chance to adopt a new stage name now that he's joined their posse. And much like how all toys don't share the same workplace dynamic, all kids don't play with their toys the same way. Andy felt like an omniscient third party overseeing this make-believe scenario, puppeteering the actions of all the toys, while Bonnie actually inserts herself into the playtime as a character in her own stories. And the improv I mentioned the toys adopt,
We do a lot of improv here.
is a direct result of Bonnie's attitude when playing with them, as we see her constantly adapting to what she's learning about Woody in real time,
Sheriff!
and incorporating what she hears from his voice box into her narrative.
Somebody's poisoned a water hole!
Poison would do such a mean thing!
The times where Bonnie actually plays with her toys lay the foundations for grander story payoffs between the moments when you get to know who these new characters are. It's incredible that they don't even begin to give away the finale, yet it all still makes perfect sense once you have the full picture. With that said, there are 2 incredibly slight, but also incredibly clever bits of foreshadowing here. The first of which is present in Woody's first line of the scene.
I'd like to join your posse, boys, but first I'm gonna sing a little song.
Woody's voice box has been pretty consistently used to reflect his current situation, with
You're my favorite deputy.
communicating how strong his bond with Andy is and that he is indeed the favorite toy,
Somebody's poisoned the water hole.
setting up Buzz crash landing into Woody's life and poisoning the water hole that is the dynamic of Andy's room,
We got to get this wagon train a moving.
and, well, this one's pretty self-explanatory. But what's extra cool about it this time is that while the meaning of his other lines is pretty readily apparent as soon as or not long after you hear them, this one means absolutely nothing to you in the moment, but can be appreciated in retrospect when you see how the story unfolds at the end. And the second of which is a lot more inconspicuous and far harder to consciously recognize on first viewing, but arguably the one that's more psychologically effective at getting you to feel at home in Bonnie's room. Remember that track that played during the scene where the toys got their first glimpse of the butterfly room? How there seemed to be a pleasant melody in there buried amongst a somewhat unsettling choice of orchestration? Well, listen very closely to that track, back to back with the final piece of music that plays during the most heartwarming and joyous part of Bonnie's playtime. They're variations of the same leitmotif, only all the somber strings from the Sunnyside version have been completely removed from Bonnie's version, instead replaced with instrumentation that is much more upbeat and soothing to listen to. The vast majority of people who've seen this movie are probably completely unaware of this even being an element of the soundtrack, and I don't blame you if you couldn't quite pick up on it immediately upon listening to those two clips back to back. It's not something that will necessarily jump right out at you because it's not supposed to. They've made this choice in the composition not to make you go, oh hey, it's that tune I recognize and love, or to save time due to Randy Newman not having to write as much new music, but to use the soundtrack to fully drive home what the audience is hopefully already feeling from the rest of the sequence, that Bonnie's room is a wholesome and welcoming place for toys to live, by tapping back into the melody previously associated with a toy's paradise but without the uncomfortable instruments that accompanied it, and in turn without the darker underbelly Sunnyside has yet to fully expose. I really love these little touches. Things like the stickers on the floor and marker stains on both the floor and the wall that help Bonnie's bedroom feel lived in and real. All the small details that stack up over time to help round out the movie and make it feel more realized and complete, in the same way that a myriad of small negative things can lead to a death by 1,000 cuts. And because these things are kept in the background, they subtly get your brain to start viewing this place in the cheerful and pleasant light they want you to, but still don't ever hint at their true intentions because none of these things can fully distract you from the fact that Woody still needs to escape Bonnie's room. That's his motivation here, and you share that motivation because you want him to get back to Andy. The most you'll feel on a first viewing, even with everything I just highlighted, is, well, at least he's having a happy day in the meantime. Unlike the other toys, who are trapped in hell forever, which is aided by the hard cut back to Sunnyside at the end of this sequence. The dappled lighting adorning both the floors and bed in Bonnie's room, which communicate that it is a safe haven for imaginative playtime, as well as her sweet, innocent laughter, all harshly conflicting with the defeated grunts and sighs of the other toys, and the striking blood-red sunset coating the caterpillar room, where the atmosphere now makes the place look more like the aftermath of a battle than a daycare, showing everyone recuperating after their various injuries at the hands of the toddlers, and with Buzz laying down in the exact same position from after he fell down the stairs in the first movie, which is another one of those neat little touches that I love calling out. By this point, the toys have obviously come to the conclusion the little kids are far too young
They're Stinky
to be playing with them, so they need to figure out how to get out of the room to talk to Lotso and get things straightened out. But even now that some amount of conflict has started to arise at this daycare, the writers are still playing the Sunnyside prison card extremely close to their chest. They aren't quite willing to expose all the various systems operating under the hood here that are designed to keep the toys in line, instead choosing to present obstacles for the characters to overcome which would be logical for any normal daycare to have, such as child-proof locks.
It's a Fenster Schneckler 380. Finest child-proof lock in the world.
Because of course, bookworm encyclopedic Ham would know the specific type of lock this is, and the Rube Goldberg-style chain of events the toys are about to employ, taking advantage of just about everything available to them in this room to circumvent these obstacles and escape, is one of the most underrated parts of the whole movie, furthering the idea of this being an ensemble story as every single toy pulls their weight and contributes to the plan in order to get the job done. It's almost hypnotic seeing them all work together with a level of precision on par with Buzz's escape from Al's toy barn in Toy Story 2, heroically flying through the air, ziplining, and parkouring his way up to the transom with all the style in the world. It gives everyone a chance to collaborate and play a part in the escape while still propping up Buzz's intelligence and capabilities, as he's the one to figure out how to get this all done and accomplish the exceptional acrobatic feats. It's certainly convenient for them that the Sunnyside employees left the transom open after closing up for the day, but it also makes sense that they would do that so as to air out the room without just leaving the windows wide open, especially for this specific room because god damn are those toddlers gross. I also think this is a good time to talk about another small thing with Toy Story 3 that I adore: the synchronization of the soundtrack with what you see on screen. What you'll find with pretty much any film score worth its salt is that it's composed to match up with the visuals, that the texture work matches the aesthetics of the environment, that the tempo is on pace with that of the action, that the intensity of the orchestra properly conveys whatever emotional reaction you're hoping to enhance, and that all of those things are in constant fluctuation as the story progresses, so you hopefully don't ever consciously think about the music and it all just naturally feels like one massive interconnected experience. It's all very basic stuff. Nothing I just described is particularly praiseworthy on its own, as it's just what you'd come to expect from film score composition. What would be worth pointing out is if a soundtrack doesn't successfully do those things. But there are some scores I've listened to that really go the extra mile and make practically every single note of the tracks line up on a microscopic, frame-perfect level with every single action the characters take. Or times where composers tie the music and picture together with instrumentation choices and BPM decisions that directly support the main ideas of the story. And just generally speaking, times where you can tell the composer worked in very close connection with the director to craft an effective film score, not just to write excellent music. And Toy Story 3 is one of the best examples I can think of where this is the case, because nearly every single piece of music in the soundtrack is composed in frame-perfect harmony with what you're seeing on screen, with a level of hyper-specific fixation you can't help but respect. It's kind of like what I do with the visuals in my videos, trying to the best of my ability to select clips where the expressions and gesticulations of the characters line up with my narration, because the more intimately the visuals and audio sync up together with each other, the more satisfying it is to watch, at least to my brain. And I pick this particular scene to bring the topic up because it's one of the clearest instances of this musical symbiosis, with the soundtrack reacting in accordance with Buzz rappelling down the door, and then again a few moments later with his footsteps. I don't know if I necessarily have the vocabulary to properly articulate the feelings I have when I see this happen, but the best I can do is say that it helps the film feel more cohesive. You probably won't be consciously aware of this stuff while you're watching the movie, especially for the first time, but you'll hopefully be able to feel it. That on a subconscious level, you'll feel the combined effect of all these elements synergizing together, and specifically the music complementing the animation to the extent that it does, helping you buy into this world knowing they put this much effort into tying the whole picture together. Which is also why you can't just take a piece of music specifically composed to sync up with the visuals of one movie and then carelessly drop it into another movie it wasn't built for and expect it to have the same impact. But I digress. I don't want to share every instance of this happening throughout Toy Story 3, both because we still have a lot of other stuff to cover over the next 4 hours, but also because I want you to discover some of these for yourself. Go ahead, rewatch Toy Story 3, keeping a keen ear and eye out for all the moments when the music and animation are in lockstep with each other like something out of Hi-Fi Rush. You'll be really impressed with what you discover. Though, speaking of discovery, we should probably return to the plot, because Buzz is about to stumble across something pretty big, as he sees Twitch and Chunk chuckling about the toys' fun playtime in the Caterpillar room, and then proceeding to cut Barbie and Ken's romance session short as they climb into A vending machine. I don't know how you even come up with this idea of a vending machine functioning as a back alley gambling spot for the bad guys, but it's just so perfect. Not even just because of how visually interesting it is, hiding something of this caliber inside an ordinary object that would also logically be found at a daycare, but also how claustrophobic it makes everything feel when slinking through the inner workings of the machine with that sickly green glow radiating through the banner outside. On top of the ingenuity in taking something as innocent as a see-and-say toy and converting it into a toy's equivalent of a roulette wheel, and giving a little peek into the economy and world of Sunnyside, showing that they use Monopoly money and batteries as currency when betting, which is something the toys would naturally always be in constant need of, sort of a twisted version of Potato Head and Ham's Battleship game from the first movie, and showing us this cutthroat game they engage in that's very becoming of the brutally unfair world we'll soon learn that Lotso has established here. Speaking of Lotso, even though he is noticeably absent from this gambling den scene because they really want to siphon as much value as they can out of Sunnyside as it is now before they tear his mask off, his presence is still felt because if you listen closely to the music playing in the background, you'll hear those same Southern Cajun rhythms from when he was first introduced, just ever so slightly tweaked to be a little more sinister sounding. Continuing to plant the seed in the audience's mind that Lotso's got a much darker side, but still without fully showing their hand just yet. All they want you and Buzz to know right now is that as far as these guys are concerned,
I'm not a girl's toy! I'm not! Why do you guys keep saying that?
no, and I guess that,
All them toys are disposable. We'll be lucky if they last us a week.
but before Buzz gets the chance to relay this information to his friends, it really is amazing how Big Baby can either be the most adorable thing in the world, or a sleep paralysis demon depending on the situation. It's extremely difficult to design a character that can effortlessly sell both of those auras without being able to say a single word, but they managed to pull it off here because his blank, innocent expressions and broken eye can initially garner some sympathy from you, but stare into them for too long and it'll start to feel horribly unsettling seeing a baby doll who only has one eye and conveys no emotion demonically towering over you. Though there is a very important logistical question about this scene that we have to address before moving on to Buzz's interrogation. We learn later that the monkey toy Bonnie was playing with in her first scene oversees the security system at night and can instantly scream over the intercom system if he sees someone trying to break out of Sunnyside. And as such, the initial question you may think to ask of how did Big Baby even know Buzz was here is retroactively answered once you understand just how much control Lotso's gang has over the daycare, but in answering one question, it also poses another in making you wonder why they sent Big Baby to collect Buzz at all instead of simply sounding the alarm like the monkey does every other time he sees something suspicious. Fortunately, there exists a very simple explanation for this. See, in an ideal world, the toys will never be the wiser about what's really going on at Sunnyside. Lotso doesn't impose martial law on Andy's toys as soon as they arrive because he'd rather never have to enforce his prison rules on any new toys, preferring instead that they'd simply be willfully obedient to the way things work around here. It's in Lotso and his crew's best interest to maintain that illusion for as long as they possibly can, which means they can't recklessly blow their lid over the most trivial of things, only if he's absolutely certain the toy he's watching is actually trying to escape. Remember that Buzz isn't making a break for the exit when he leaves the caterpillar room. He's just going for a wander around the facilities trying to find Lotso. The monkey is shown later in the movie to not instantly sound the alarm at the first sight of trouble, waiting to see if Buzz, Ken, and Big Baby can handle it before making a decision. So with all that in mind, it makes much more sense to just keep a very close eye on Buzz to observe what he's doing and handle it quietly by sending Big Baby into the vending machine, especially since something we learned from this scene is that the toys could eventually become keepers.
Hey, what do you guys think of the new recruits? Any keepers?
Which is code for gang members, really asking the question, do you think any of the toys will end up working with us?
But that, space guy, he could be useful.
Remember, at this point in time, these toys haven't begun to see Sunnyside as a prison yet. They only see the locks on the doors of the caterpillar room as standard human-made obstacles they have to overcome. Nothing they haven't had to deal with in previous movies. And if the monkey was keeping an eye on them, then he would know they don't have any deeper suspicions because the cameras provide both video and audio feedback.
Too late for a stroll, eh, potato head?
So he'd be able to hear their whole conversation. If the monkey sounded the alarm simply because Buzz broke out of the room and ended up being wrong about what his intentions were, then he'd have just blown their entire operation and risked losing a potential ally over absolutely nothing. It's only once they realize Buzz has learned too much that they decide they have to take more drastic measures. It's also important to keep in mind that based on what we see during the failed breakout montage later, the average toy is not anywhere near as headstrong or competent as Andy's toys. The Sunnyside crew has clearly never gone up against an opponent this powerful before, thus explaining their more lackadaisical attitude when handling a situation of this sort. But then, once they understand what they're really up against,
Cracked down hard since you left.
but that's enough stalling, that's enough dramatic buildup. Now that the gang has captured Buzz, it's time for Lotso's true colors to finally reveal themselves. This scene is so densely packed with nuance in how Lotso behaves, as every move he makes and every word he speaks has a double meaning that masterfully crescendos at the final needle drop moment. So I want to tackle this moment by moment, almost second by second, to properly break down the mechanics under the hood that make this reveal so strong. The scene starts with Lotso opening the door and innocently asking Ken what's going on and why Buzz is all tied up. On one level, from Buzz's perspective, he thinks the question is being asked because Lotso is wholly unaware of this dark underworld operation at Sunnyside, and that his subordinates have acted out of line and against his orders. But then, on another level, from the perspective of Ken and the others, Lotso is asking because he's concerned about what Buzz might know about him and his empire. Lotso's walking into this situation without any context for how things have escalated to this point. He doesn't know everything yet, and as such, there might still be a chance to save face with the new arrivals, so he maintains his friendly persona through the tone of his voice.
Why is this toy tied up?
But he's clearly not fully friendly and also not fully evil. He acts as if he's an innocent old codger with a cane, stumbling into something unruly, but his facial expressions tell a different story. So then Ken answers his question by saying that Buzz simply got out of the caterpillar room, and Lotso again has a reaction that communicates one thing externally but means another thing internally.
Got out?
A reaction that expresses both a sentiment of confusion as to how exactly he managed to do that given the
Fenster Schneckler 380.
but also, that's it? He just got out of the caterpillar room? Why would that ever be something worth tying him up over? Why are you making it sound like we're trying to trap him here? Proceeding to say,
This isn't how we treat our guests.
outwardly belittling Ken in front of Buzz, both to make sure Ken knows he screwed up in a very public manner and to make sure Buzz thinks he's not in on this chicanery and it's just a handful of bad apples trying to spoil the bunch. Not that Sunnyside as a whole is rotten to the core. Even though the audience knows by now that obviously Ken wouldn't have even bothered saying,
He got out, Lotso.
in such a casual manner as if this is just the logical course of action to take after a toy leaves the caterpillar room if he didn't already expect Lotso to be on board with what they were doing, it still makes sense for Lotso's character to try to maintain the illusion for as long as he can so the toys don't try to rebel and make things even harder for them in the long run.
There you go. I'm so sorry.
Which then leads us to the next part of the scene. Buzz asking for him and all of his friends to be transferred to the butterfly room, to which Lotso only approves Buzz for a transfer.
I'll go get my friends.
Whoa, whoa, hold on there, boss. Those caterpillar kids need someone to play with.
There's no way Lotso didn't hear what Buzz asked him. He couldn't have possibly been any clearer with his request.
Children in the caterpillar room are not age appropriate for me and my friends. We respectfully request a transfer to the butterfly room.
His answer here was a deliberate move based on all the information he acquired in the less than 30 seconds it had been since he entered this room, where he had to make the best call he could in what had quickly spiraled into a very regrettable situation. Lotso has a vested interest in keeping Andy's toys in that caterpillar room because they serve as toddler fodder that keep him and his cronies safe from their violent playtime, and he has deduced that since Buzz figured out a way to escape the caterpillar room, he's clearly a very competent individual who's capable of handling himself, and also proved himself to be very intelligent, confident, and articulate when confronting authority figures, and would therefore be a great asset for helping to keep the folks at Sunnyside in line, which is basically what he explains to his henchmen without directly saying any of it in front of Buzz.
This toy's shown initiative, leadership. I'd say we found ourselves a keeper.
Because we've already heard that term, keeper, used once before in the gambling den, and it was with a much different connotation than Lotso has now.
Hey, what do you guys think of the new recruits? Any keepers? How about that, space guy? He could be useful.
Lotso's choices in response to Buzz's request are to either deny him outright and lose a potential ally, or specifically promise him and him alone the wonderful life he's asking for and hope he succumbs to his selfish desires, even if it means abandoning his friends. Either way, Lotso wins. Either Buzz accepts his offer and Lotso gains a keeper, as it were, or Buzz denies him and so Lotso restrains Buzz as a result because he can't let him go back to the other toys with all the knowledge he now possesses from what he's seen, so he may as well try to keep the peace instead of immediately resorting to brainwashing. I love that you can watch this scene from two totally different characters' perspectives and perfectly track the progression of Lotso's mindset through them both, because it makes for an even more engaging viewing experience, especially on a rewatch, and also helps establish that Lotso isn't a villain who randomly becomes an unrecognizably different character when it's time for him to go full dictator mode. This has been who Lotso was the entire time. He still maintains his charismatic personality, even after this reveal. This scene just recontextualizes why he was so bubbly and friendly at the beginning. Not out of the kindness of his heart, but because he was trying to butter them up. And that's what showing Lotso acting in this manner accomplishes. By more explicitly communicating his villainous nature to the audience, even while he's still trying to play nice with Buzz, it helps you understand that this is what he was like ever since he was first introduced, and it shows how masterful he is at manipulating people when he's even able to sway someone as mentally acute as Buzz Lightyear through his carefully calculated soliloquy. And now that the mask is off, the writers don't have to hold back on letting you know just how intimidating of a villain he is, starting with resetting Buzz to his original factory settings with information he obtained through the official Buzz Lightyear instruction manual, which of course Sunnyside would have on hand because plenty of different types of toys would come through the daycare over the years, and there's no reason not to keep the instruction manuals around in case you ever need them in the future, especially when dealing with a toy as popular as Buzz Lightyear. In fact, its presence at Sunnyside is actually rather horrifying to think about, because the fact that it's here means that there was a Buzz Lightyear action figure in the daycare at one point, but it didn't survive Lotso's rule. And even though it may not have been the Buzz we know and love, it's still not a particularly pleasant picture to paint in your head. And then, as if that wasn't enough, they pile on even more layers of existential terror as the bookworm throws down the manual and Lotso menacingly picks it up off the floor, opens it, and reads from it right in front of Buzz. Can you imagine being a toy, restrained in front of someone holding a book that reveals to him every last secret of how your body works and how he can completely bend you to his every will? It's intensely disturbing on an existential level to watch Buzz get reverted to demo mode, to have to watch him screaming out bloody murder as his brain is completely corrupted with just one simple flip of a switch. Also, yes, toys do have these demo modes that revert them to their factory settings, which in Buzz's case would be his delusional state from the first movie. Like, the actual real-life Buzz Lightyear toy has a demo mode. Apparently some people didn't know toys actually had these things in the real world. So, The more you know. In any case, we leave this scene with a blood-curdling scream that offers us a perfect moment to jump back to the other toys in the caterpillar room where they hear that same scream, just a lot more muffled, as your mind is racing with the thought of what will become of Buzz and what putting him in demo mode actually means in execution, and whether all his memories over the last decade were just permanently erased. But you don't even have time to process any of that before they immediately throw another curveball your way, as Mrs. Potato Head decides to investigate the noise they heard using the same trick Mr. Potato Head used in the first two movies, only to suddenly have a vision of Andy roaming through the halls of Sunnyside. As if you didn't already have enough questions to occupy your headspace. Fortunately, this one's answered a little quicker as she almost immediately concludes that it's a flash of vision from her missing eye, so she blocks out the input from her left eye and now has a window back into what's going on at Andy's house, which is such a clever way to keep tabs on that story thread because they laid down breadcrumbs for this payoff in the very first present-day scene of the movie.
I can't find my other eye!
Some say this comes totally out of nowhere and that her other eye just magically starts working for no real reason, but that's not true. The reason why she's only now receiving ocular input in this specific scene when she previously wasn't is because this is when Andy's actually starting to make significant headway on packing his things for college, and you're naturally going to be doing a lot of decluttering through the process of packing, and by peeling back the layers of the room, you'll find things you lost that fell behind the shelf or were otherwise buried amongst the scrap, which is why the eye starts working at this moment. It's finally been exposed to the light again after being concealed in infinite darkness for who knows how long.
Where'd you leave it this time?
Someplace dark and dusty.
And in essence, having an eye stuck in a black void is functionally indistinct from only having one working eye, and is also a smart way to pay off the idea of the Potato Heads being a one-eyed family ever since the first movie by leveraging that concept for the progression of the plot. Because now Mrs. Potato Head can see firsthand that Andy is beside himself at the thought that his toys might have been thrown away, which she pieces together by watching him searching around the attic, gesturing towards the spot on the floor where he left the toys, and then a trash bag to explain what they were kept in, and the reaction on both him and his mom's faces after he does that. They did a great job of conveying exactly what the characters are saying here, even without being able to hear a single line of dialogue, and it doesn't at all feel forced or unrealistic that their body language would be this expressive when talking about something that we know Andy cares as deeply about as the toys. Which means now everyone's firm stance from earlier in the film has been completely nullified by this new revelation. And just like in the first movie when they realized Woody really was telling the truth about Buzz the whole time, there's no ego here at all. Well, okay, there's a little bit of friendly banter between Mr. Potato Head and Ham in that regard.
And you didn't believe him.
Hey, you didn't believe him first.
Guys!
But they don't try to weasel out of being wrong and stubbornly refuse to accept the truth to protect their pride. They all instantly understand the mistake they've made. Rex, in fact, is happy to hear this news because he doesn't care if he was wrong when it means Andy really did still care about him. And they actually have a reason to trust Mrs. Potato Head when she relays this information to them because unlike Woody, she doesn't gain anything by lying to them, because as far as she knows, Buzz is currently in the process of getting them all moved to the butterfly room so they can have a happy life at Sunnyside. She doesn't know what's really happened to him yet. There's no reason for her to want to leave right now unless she was telling the truth about what she saw through her other eye, and so now Jessie steps up to the plate to announce to everyone they need to get home in the absence of Buzz being around to lead them, which then makes this the perfect time for Lotso to make his grand return, sinisterly illuminated by the headlights of his dump truck while all the other Caterpillar toys scurry off to the shadows where he won't be able to find them. And now the jig is completely up. Lotso has to lay down the law and assert his control over the toys because there was no way he ever could have let Buzz return to the others without compromising the inner workings of Lotso's gang. That, combined with the fact that if one of them was this insubordinate and rebellious, then the rest of them likely would be as well, means he couldn't be Mr. Nice Guy anymore. He had to make sure the toys understood in no uncertain terms exactly where they stood in his domain, as he bluntly tells Mrs. Potato Head that she and her friends are never gonna leave Sunnyside, and when she tries to resist, he
Ah, that's better.
which doesn't actually make any sense at all, because we know potato head parts should still work perfectly fine even if they're not attached to the body, as was proven as recently as literally 1 minute ago. Unfortunately, the exact ruling on this issue is something that the Toy Story series consistently and frustratingly fluctuates between. It is very necessary for the plot of these stories that their parts are able to function independently from their bodies, but the second they want to make a joke about how annoying someone's being, they suddenly stop working. Hell, even in the epilogue of this movie, we see Mr. Potato Head's mouth still works even when it gets knocked out by the peas.
I told you kids, stay out of my butt!
Some argue that Lotso may just be physically pressing her lips together so she can't get any words out, which is possible, but I don't know if I buy that a plush bear has that good of a grip strength. However, in this very specific instance, it could be argued that Lotso taking her mouth off as brazenly and shamelessly as he didn't actually make her mouth stop working, it just stunned her to silence because of how shocked she was that Lotso was willing to violate her personal space in the way that he did. And regardless of the mechanics behind how the potato head parts work, that is what's most important about this show of force. Lotso demonstrating how little he cares about the boundaries of these toys. They live under his control. Their personal autonomy is worthless to him, and there is no such thing as a safe space for them anymore. And there's no one better to help make that crystal clear for the toys than
Buzz, you're back! Hooyah! Buzz?
It can be easy for people to roll their eyes and say, oh, so they went back to this old trope again, did they? But Prison Guard Buzz isn't a carbon copy of Toy Story or even Toy Story 2 delusional Buzz. That stare is filled with a sense of cold-blooded evil we've never seen in him before. These two throwbacks to Buzz's original form do not at all serve the same purpose in the narrative. In Toy Story 2, he was the foil that acted as a mirror for Buzz to stare into and see how completely insane he was in the first movie, and it allowed the writers to leverage the comedic potential of having two different versions of the same character play off each other. But in Toy Story 3, he's not here to make you laugh, he's here to rattle you. He's far more aggressive and ruthless than any previous version of Buzz, because now he's got someone as vicious as Lotso in his ear, which is terrifying. Buzz has always been on the side of our heroes whenever he was in Space Ranger mode, even in Toy Story 2, but when turned against them and forced to take orders from someone with a soul darker than a moonless night, he is an absolutely menacing force to be reckoned with who could take any one of them in a fight. In fact, he can take on all of the toys at once in a fight and completely mop the floor with them, and there's nothing any of them could tell him to snap him out of his trance. Rex is equally as, if not more knowledgeable about Buzz's lore than Lotso would be, but even if he tried to use his expertise to sway Buzz to his side, it would have just bounced right off him. Lotso foresaw the possibility that they'd try to plead their case to him,
Buzz, we're your friends!
Spare me your lies, temptress.
and explicitly warned him that was something they'd try to do.
Remember, they'll say anything to make you doubt yourself.
He's been completely suckered into Lotso's world. We saw in the first film that Buzz wasn't one to nonchalantly take orders from some random schmuck he's just met, standing off against Woody and his friends until he saw the sheriff's badge and Woody confirmed the other toys were friends, not foes. That was a situation where Buzz believed to have crash-landed on a strange planet, left alone to put the pieces of the puzzle together by himself, and would therefore automatically treat any new life forms as a threat unless given solid reasoning to believe otherwise. But here at Sunnyside, when he wakes up in demo mode, he would be immediately surrounded with a group of people as if they had been the ones to wake him up from hypersleep as opposed to being forced awake by a crash.
The impact must have awoken me from hypersleep.
Which is something he believes they only would have done if there was an urgent mission for which his skills were required.
All Space Rangers are to be in hypersleep until awakened by authorized personnel.
Sort of a, wake me when you need me situation. And considering the implications of the presence of his instruction manual, as well as the popularity of Buzz as a toy and his story,
Not that story.
it stands to reason that Lotso would know exactly what he needed to say, all the right words to use to be as assertive, commanding, and knowledgeable as needed to convince Buzz he was who he claimed to be.
Come on, we need you back at Star Command.
Also, even if we completely ignore all of that, it has been previously established that it actually doesn't take all that much to convince a delusional Buzz that you are someone who's also fighting against Zurg's forces.
Buzz, I know how to defeat Zurg!
You do?
Come on, I'll tell you on the way!
So Buzz works with the rest of Lotso's team to lock up Andy's toys, and only Andy's toys, with the exception of Mr. Potato Head, whose exceptionally abrasive personality earned him the privilege of what is essentially solitary confinement in the box out on the playground. None of the other Caterpillar Room toys are treated this way because these guys are the only ones daring to resist Lotso's orders. The others have already made their attempts to flee the scene. They've already had their night in the box and have resigned themselves to Lotso's regime, accepting that any escape efforts are futile and aren't in need of any further discipline from Lotso and his crew, whereas Andy's toys have proven to be far more aggressive and unyielding, not willing to roll over and stand idly by unless someone forces them into that position, preferably someone they know very well and who they'd have a much harder time fighting back against. And to add insult to injury, Lotso has one more trick up his sleeve.
Well, you're just hurting yourself.
Woody! What did you do to him?
As if turning their most adept warrior against them wasn't enough, showing them Woody's hat just solidifies that feeling of fear and hopelessness in their hearts. The two leaders of their family taken out of commission in one way or another, leaving the rest to fend for themselves. The audience and Lotso both know he didn't actually do anything to Woody, and he's safe and sound back at Bonnie's house, but the other toys don't. They never saw what happened to him after he walked through that door. Lotso doesn't know what happened to him either, but he doesn't need to, and he doesn't care. He knows showing them this hat will force their imagination to fill in the gaps, and that after everything they just suffered through, the toys would almost certainly jump to the worst case scenario. So Lotso uses Woody's hat against them to reinforce that even the best of the best toys aren't immune to Lotso, and he is not to be messed with. The toys were already feeling shameful for doing something stupid that fractured their family and landed themselves at Sunnyside to begin with, but the thought that their actions could have led to something unforgivable happening to Woody just pushes that guilt over the edge. Jessie especially taking it harder than anyone, with her being the one who led the charge to get everyone piled into the donation box. And it makes sense for Lotso to be able to find this hat because
Lotso has trucks patrolling all night long.
This entire segment of the film, from Buzz's interrogation to the final shot of Buzz ominously looming over the toys he once called his friends, is such a tightly written and emotionally engaging way to completely flip the story around by dismantling so many different character dynamics and leaving the trajectory of the toys' lives entirely uncertain, and it stockpiles all these bombshells one after the other in such a condensed period of time that leaves you just as gobsmacked at what's just unfolded as the characters are, jumping straight from Lotso's villainous reveal to Buzz's haunting brainwashing to the bewildering holographic visuals that then go on to undermine the toys' understanding of Andy's feelings about them, to then mash all those threads together and fully shine a spotlight on what kind of frightfully heinous place Sunnyside really is. No geographic cheats or changes were made to this room, and yet it still conveys two entirely opposite moods and atmospheres. This isn't a Jurassic Park situation, fantastic film to be clear, where a T-Rex paddock somehow becomes a cliff in a later scene. The Caterpillar Room is exactly the same as it was when they first showed up, and through nothing more than a simple change in lighting and the exponentially amplified dramatic weight of the script, they managed to transform it from being a happy, fun playroom to a prison block, showing that the warm and comforting color palette which decorated the walls of Sunnyside earlier that morning was indeed nothing more than a facade, and the true colors of both Sunnyside and Lotso have finally been revealed. It is, from beginning to end, absolutely superb storytelling. Oh, also Barbie and Ken broke up. I guess. How sad. I also like the detail that Sparks doesn't actually ride the truck like the rest of Lotso's henchmen. He just grabs onto the side of it for support while his roller wheels carry him the rest of the way, and then the next morning he uses the momentum built up from riding around to slingshot himself for some extra fun. Yeah, I know, it's silly, it doesn't really matter to anything, but it's an instance of them choosing to use the unique aspects of Sparks' design to add a bit of extra flair to the animation, and that's pretty cool. Something which can't be said for the toy's current situation, though fortunately, things are going a little bit better for Woody over at Bonnie's house, as he continues his quest to get back to Andy by checking Bonnie's backpack to figure out where her house is. The other toys happen to hear Woody rustling around, and while they are initially sad and confused that Woody's gonna be leaving soon after having such a fun day together, they completely empathize with his desire to get home because they understand that his connection to Andy is equivalent to their connection with Bonnie. So Dolly doesn't hesitate to help him figure out where he needs to go.
We're on it, cowboy.
Hey, remember when she wasn't a total bitch?
Woody, can't you see I'm threatening everyone? Go back to the closet.
Yeah, I know.
Showing how supportive, understanding, and endearing Bonnie's toys are is just as important as showing how loving of an owner Bonnie herself is. The audience needs to like these new toys so that at the end of the movie, when Woody and the gang make this place their new home, they feel like they're joining a loving and welcoming new family rather than a group of total strangers. So even though they don't really have a lot of screen time to work with when they're at Bonnie's house, they do so much with so little, helping you get to know these new toys by giving everyone their own little moment. Whether that be Buttercup and Pricklepants' friendly back and forth banter, Dolly's emphatic but pleasant leadership, or Trixie's fountain of nerdy enthusiasm that overflows as soon as they need to use the computer to help Woody get home.
Who's Velocitar 237?
Oh, that's just a dinosaur toy down the street. Let me just take care of that. Just a dinosaur.
I know this is just two dinosaur toys talking to each other, but could you imagine if you were a kid playing an online game, unaware that the people you were chatting and playing with were actually toys the entire time? Once Trixie dismisses her dinosaur buddy, Woody discovers that Bonnie's house is right around the corner from Andy's house, which, considering they almost certainly attended the same daycare, something they worked to imply previously, isn't very far-fetched. But my favorite thing about this scene is this moment right here. After Woody discovers that Andy and Bonnie are neighbors, and the very first thing he does is run over to Totoro from the movie My Neighbor Totoro to give him a big hug. And then, at the very end of the film, when the toys are having their final playtime, Totoro is purposely separated from the others and propped up against the big tree in Bonnie's backyard, as if it's his own little personal space akin to the camphor tree in which he and his friends reside in his own movie. It's nothing overt or eye-rollingly self-indulgent like some big fanservice-y MCU-style moment. Woody doesn't walk up to him and say, "Well, Totoro, I guess I can start calling you my neighbor from now on, eh?" Most people probably won't even be aware that these two things happened, but it's a sweet little tribute to a sweet little slice of life movie that makes me smile every time I see it, so I wanted to take some time to talk about it. They can throw you away in Toy Story 4 and try to erase you from history in modern publications of the Toy Story 3 color script because of legal issues, but you will always and forever be a delightfully sweet and worthy addition to this movie. And he's also the last bit of innocent sweetness you're gonna get in this movie for quite a while, as Woody casually mentions Sunnyside on his way out the door, telling Bonnie's toys to get the message to his friends over there that he made it home, to which they react with horror and start to tell him the true nature of what goes on at that daycare, and how heinous Lotso is beneath his huggable plush exterior. But no one's in a better position to share that story of suffering with Woody than Chuckles, having previously shared an owner with Lotso, Daisy, knowing how special she was to him and knowing exactly what broke him and turned him into the loathsome monster he is now. And while Chuckles may not have received any physical injuries as a result of this altercation, you can still hear how badly his voice has sullied over the years after how chipper and buoyant he was under Daisy's care.
No, she only replaced you. But Lotso wasn't my friend anymore. He wasn't anyone's friend.
This backstory Chuckles regales isn't an exposition dump that Woody happened to stumble into on his way home, because Bonnie's room is a safe haven for abandoned Sunnyside toys.
How'd you get out?
Bonnie found me, took me home.
Not like she's consciously trying to do this. She's not some hardened Sunnyside rebel who secretly knows about the underground toy dictatorship and is trying to save as many as she can one by one, but she is inadvertently doing it nonetheless with any broken or lost toy she finds, which she'd be able to get away with doing because her mom works there, so she can let one or two missing toys slide every once in a while, assuming she even knows her daughter is doing this at all. Point is, Woody doesn't just randomly stumble into a plot fairy. Some people believe it's rather convenient that the Pizza Planet truck drops off Lotso right in front of Sunnyside of all the places they could have hit a bump in the road, but I would lump this under the category of contrivances that kick the story into motion. This is the state of affairs the toys were railroaded into confronting when they arrived at Sunnyside, and this is the backstory that led to the creation of that state of affairs, not a major endgame payoff coming as a result of something contrived. It's also not at all unbelievable that Daisy's parents forgot to bring her toys back home with them, even knowing how important they clearly were to her, because Lotso was put down quite a significant distance away from where their picnic blanket was laid out. So it seems perfectly reasonable that her parents would have gotten so swept up in spending quality family time with their daughter that they were only focusing on getting her back home, and the toys just slipped their minds as they only bothered to pack up the things immediately surrounding them. Now, surprisingly, we're actually going to stop talking about this flashback right here. There's a lot more to unpack in this scene I haven't covered yet because Lotso's tragic backstory is essential for understanding who he is as a villain and how he views the world, but for right now we're just gonna put a pin in this and come back to it a little bit later when it's more relevant to the story. And then we can get a complete picture of what really makes Lotso tick. The important thing to focus on for the moment is Woody, because being faced with all this new information about Lotso and his tyrannical rule over Sunnyside presents him with a choice representative of the crux of his dilemma throughout this film, that his loyalty is being tested and pushed to its limits as the two most important things in his life, Andy and his friends, are pulling him in two drastically different directions. He prides himself on always being there for the people who matter most to him, no matter the circumstances, but for the first time, he's unable to do that for both of them at once. And his rationale when he left Sunnyside was that he would put what his kid wants first above anything else. The idea being that he can't control his friends to stop them from staying behind, and even though he doesn't want to leave them, he's not willing to compromise on what Andy wants because Woody thinks he still needs to be there for him at college, which is why he wants to get back home. As far as he knew up until this point, his friends were safe at Sunnyside. His instincts were telling him this wasn't a place they should be, but even he couldn't deny there was no actual evidence of it being the sad and lonely place he preached about on the drive here, which is why he was willing to leave. He obviously didn't like having to split up, but so long as he knew they weren't in any danger, he was able to leave for Andy's sake. But now that he knows the truth about Sunnyside, he has to decide whether he sticks to his original plan and goes home to Andy, leaving his friends behind in a place he knows they're suffering at, or heroically charges into the lion's den to rescue them and run the risk of missing his window to go with Andy to college. A conundrum that has implications both in the immediate present in navigating such a treacherous situation, but also for the long term, with Woody starting to question what his ideal future really looks like and whether his allegiances were well founded or not. But right now, that doesn't matter. If he knows his friends are at risk, then nothing in the world could stop him from coming to the rescue because no toy ever gets left behind, no matter what, whatever it takes, and he'll figure out the rest as he goes along. So Woody sneaks back into Bonnie's backpack, ready to return to Sunnyside the following morning, shortly after Lotso finishes taunting the toys after their first night of lockup, and returning Mr. Potato Head after his first night in the box.
It was cold and dark. Nothing but sand and a couple of Lincoln logs.
I don't think those were Lincoln logs.
Not very classy, Pixar. You had 2 burp jokes and a fart joke in Toy Story 2 and a poop joke in Toy Story 3. Boo! At least this one's a little less overt than it was in the last movie.
Good heavens. Was that me? Oh my!
But I'm still not a fan. Never have been in any movie, in any context. Sorry.
Oh, mostly potty humor, poop, vomit, that kind of thing.
Really? Ugh, that is like the lowest form of comedy.
Anyway, I love how Ken is wearing a different outfit in basically every single scene. Pixar certainly got their money's worth out of the endless clothing variations of the Barbie and Ken toy line they had access to when making this movie. Well, more so on Ken's side of things than Barbie's, but We'll touch on that more in just a little bit. Right now, Woody's busy sneaking back through the rafters following the sound of the screaming kids in order to figure out which panels will take him to the caterpillar room where his friends are. And once he arrives, we get a brief reprise of the rough play sequence from earlier, but this time it's nowhere near as visceral or visually chaotic. Because the first time you were supposed to be viewing the scene from the perspective of Buzz and the others, with the manic camera movements and low angles all working to support their feelings of terror in conjunction with the music, whereas this time you're looking at the scene through Woody's perspective, so the camera is much more still as he's not actively being subjected to the rough play and is merely observing it all from a distance, reflexively cringing at seeing how the toddlers are treating his friends. Though since we're getting another glimpse at how these toddlers treat their toys, and now that we fully understand how much the other toys live in perpetual fear of Lotso's wrath, it seems like a good time to bring up another very frequently asked question regarding the plot of Toy Story 3. That being, why does every single toy at this place act like everything is totally fine and dandy when Andy's toys show up even though they know they are regularly being abused? Why don't they try to warn the newcomers of the impending torture they're about to endure? Well, for as depressing as the answer to this question is, these toys would be desperate to get away from that abusive playtime. If you've been a victim of Lotso's dictatorship for presumably years, for as grim as it is, you might even be ecstatic to see shiny brand new toys for the kids to slobber over show up because you know it means they're gonna give you a break. And you might also just be tempted to pretend everything is lovely at Sunnyside and let the other toys take the heat. Yeah, it's horrible. You'd love to think that if you were in their situation, you'd be morally conscionable enough to warn the new toys, or to try to do something to help and not just selfishly cower in the corner without saying so much as a word to them, but I honestly don't know that you'd be physically capable of resisting the temptation to keep quiet after everything Lotso put you through. Consider this for a second. Remember that Lotso tells the toys they have to earn their way into the butterfly room.
If you start at the bottom, pay your dues, life here can be a dream come true.
Some people will say he's just blowing smoke up their asses and promising something he'll never be able to give them, but that's not true. We know Lotso is actually telling the truth here because he already proved that he's willing to promote toys to the butterfly room when he granted Buzz's transfer request, and in a much more subtle example that you'd only notice if you were paying ultra close attention, this penguin toy and the grappling toy that we see trying to escape the caterpillar room in a flashback are both also shown to be members of the butterfly room during the very first scene at Sunnyside. They started at the bottom, paid their dues, and now life for them is a dream come true. Because after failing to escape, these toys accepted their fate at the hands of the toddlers and eventually earned their way into the butterfly room, believing that breaking out of Lotso's impenetrable defenses really is impossible. Lotso has thoroughly destroyed everybody's will to leave Sunnyside, and if anybody ever tries, they are immediately reprimanded with extreme prejudice. And if you don't ever make it to the butterfly room, you may end up sustaining so much damage from the toddlers as the years go on that the only hope you have of ever being free from the torture is being thrown away and meeting the fate that awaits all who are dumped off at the landfill. It's spine-chillingly sickening, and we can even see it happen in real time over the course of this film with this poor little train. We see it happily chugging along when the toys are first brought to the caterpillar room, carelessly rammed around during the initial rough play sequence, and then ultimately tossed down the trash chute when Woody returns the next morning. This penguin and this grappler are the only other toys we can verifiably say went from being in the caterpillar room to the butterfly room. There surely were others, but even the other toys shown in the escape montage is still stuck in the caterpillar room, so we know Lotso doesn't grant these requests very often, but he does grant them. It is a possibility. It has happened before, meaning it could certainly happen again, and the mere existence of that possibility is all Lotso needs to maintain his iron grip over his subjects. An iron grip that firmly prevents any of these toys from banding together and rising up against their oppressors, both psychologically and physically, because Lotso's crew is comprised of action figures far more capable of putting up a fight than any of the other toys we see in the caterpillar room, which is part of why Lotso has chosen the teammates that he has. He surrounded himself with much stronger soldiers to do all the fighting for him, and he's also living in a room where he's kept in peak physical condition and where children play with toys very gently, whereas the Caterpillar Room toys are pushed to the absolute brink every single day. Psychologically, it's a very similar situation to what we see happening in A Bug's Life, where even though the ants outnumber the grasshoppers and could easily overwhelm them if they wanted to, they don't because of how thoroughly Hopper gaslit them all into believing they were less worthy than him and existed exclusively to serve grasshoppers, and how deeply ingrained into their brains this way of life had become. And that applies to both the Caterpillar Room victims and Lotso's guards. Lotso's corrupted all of them, either by swaying them to this dark side or by instilling this as the everyday norm you must endure if you have any hope of eventually earning your way into the Butterfly Room. For as torturous as this life clearly is for them, it could be rationalized as being better than stepping into the great unknown with no guarantee of not being lost or thrown away or destroyed in the process.
Dangerous world out there for a toy.
A classic case of the devil you know versus the devil you don't. Toys are donated to a daycare when the owner has decided they're done playing with them, which isn't a decision Andy consciously made. So even though the toys we know have a guaranteed destination to go back to that drives their resolve to escape, most if not all of the other toys have been passed on by their kids who no longer want or need them and don't have that safety net to fall back on. But within the walls of Sunnyside, Lotso promises that you can eventually earn your way up to the Butterfly Room and start living the good life like him and his friends, giving even more reason for people to try not to escape or form any sort of rebellion. So, to finally bring it back to the original question of why the toys don't speak up against Lotso, exposing the truth is a guaranteed way to make sure you don't get that promotion you're so desperately craving. Yet still, statistically speaking, not every single toy would be willing to hold back the truth, and Shattered Telephone is that one toy who wouldn't stand idly by and let this continue. Which then leads us into finally getting the payoff to the nice little setup from earlier in the movie, where he was bumping into Woody trying to get his attention. In the moment, you might assume he's just happy to see a new toy because of his painted smile, saying hello just like all the other toys, but on rewatch, these little bumps suddenly seems so much more desperate. A cry to warn Woody of what's to come from someone who has no other way to talk to him. Only he can't, because Lotso's in the area and the kids are gonna come back from recess soon, which is why his eyes nervously glance back at Lotso as soon as he starts to talk again. But why did he choose Woody as the toy to go after, you ask, when he wouldn't know he's considered to be the leader of these toys? Well, remember all those shots I pointed to last time showing how thoroughly unimpressed, and even somewhat suspicious of Sunnyside Woody was during their arrival sequence? Shattered Telephone couldn't see what was going on in the Butterfly Room, but the toys' reactions in the Caterpillar Room were no different, and he could definitely see those. He never had a chance of convincing the other toys to run while they had the chance, so it had to be Woody, as he was the only toy not utterly swept away by the charm of Lotso's southern drawl. It's only now that Woody's returned, in a location entirely removed from the toddlers and during a time when Lotso is currently being played with himself, that he has a chance to let Woody in on the secrets of this place and how it all works, which of course he would be aware of after all his years of experience.
I've been here years. They'll never break me.
And this is when the movie starts gearing up for the most elaborate and intricately plotted sequence across the entire trilogy thus far: the prison break out of Sunnyside. The transition over the course of the film from feeling like that old, familiar Toy Story place to something much darker, depressing, and downright despicable has been so gradual until this moment, when all the cards are finally on the table and there's no more secrets left to hide, and now they go all in with the prison escape narrative. The tone instantly kicking into high gear, as if you've been catapulted into a totally different movie as Shattered Telephone flashes you through a tightly edited, dynamically shot, electrically scored, and passionately narrated montage of all the obstacles the toys are gonna have to overcome, all of which you've already been introduced to going as far back as the moment we originally arrived at Sunnyside, where the very first thing we learned about this place was that there were electronic locks on the doors, and Andy's mom bomb had to be buzzed through in order to enter. See, I told you that'd be important for later. The locked doors, the patrol trucks, the impenetrable wall, they've been flagging all the dangers of the daycare this entire time, and they spread out the introduction of these elements intermittently over the course of the movie so as to not overwhelm you, which is why even though the visual presentation and tone is so radically different from the film we've been watching up until this point, you completely buy into it because none of this is new information. It's just the moment when all the different components finally crash together and the grim reality of what the toys are up against finally sets in. Every second we've spent at Sunnyside was all to make sure you fully understood the ins and outs of how everything worked before the big breakout sequence. With one little exception, of course, that being the monkey, the eye in the sky, whose physical eyes almost look like those of a security camera themselves, all while sharing the stories of the toys who came before them that tried and failed to make a break for it, with ominous red lights and shadows looming over everyone to enhance the sheer terror running through these toys' vinyl veins every second they stay at this place, not to mention the monkey's demonic scream and copyrighted cymbal slamming as its eyes bulge out of its head. Oh, you think I'm kidding about the copyright? Nope, Disney apparently legally owns the rights to these symbols being slammed together by a toy monkey, which is why, even though in Stephen King's short story The Monkey, the titular monkey was slamming its cymbals, director Osgood Perkins was not allowed to use that in his film adaptation because Disney locked it in copyright jail as soon as Toy Story 3 came out.
Legally? Everything in here's mine.
Not to say you should get offended on behalf of the director or anything. He's been a good sport about it, and believes replacing the cymbals with drums actually enhanced the dramatic build-up to major events in the movie. And having seen it myself, I'd have to agree. I'd say it was overall a positive thing for the monkey, but also, are you fucking kidding me, Disney? This is almost as bad as when you tried to trademark the entirety of Dia de los Muertos, an actual Mexican holiday, just because Pixar made Coco. You know, you think you hate Disney. You think you have an appropriate amount of venomous contempt for this vile corporation, but you don't. Enough is never enough. This isn't yours, Disney. You didn't invent the cymbal-slamming toy monkey. It's been used in several other major movies. The toy itself has been around since 1932. That was almost 100 years ago. What are you doing? What the fuck is wrong with you? Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so now the stakes are set and the time frame has been established. We know what Lotso's patrol forces look like, and we know the toys only have one night to circumvent all of them, fix Buzz, and get back to Andy's house before he heads off to college in the morning, leaving the toys with a rapidly ticking clock and very little room for error as the slightest slip-up could completely blow their cover. With no time to waste, Woody lets the other toys know he's still alive, safely hidden inside the play structure away from the cameras in case anybody's watching. They inform him Buzz has once again fallen victim to the old Space Ranger routine.
Oh no.
Oh yes, Return of the Astronaut.
And we get a bit of a throwback to the first movie at Sid's house, with Woody gathering up the troops to form a plan to rescue Buzz and get out. But this time it's with our core group of heroes, and there's so many more variables at play than there ever were before. Every single character has a critical role to play in what's about to unfold, and there's so many moving components that if even one thing goes wrong, it could all fall apart in an instant, which is the exact kind of delicately complex scheme that would be required to escape this place. Sunnyside Daycare has been built up as an impenetrable fortress with logical surveillance systems set up to prevent escape, and is only defeated by Woody's ingenious escape plan using everybody's strengths, weaknesses, and unique skill sets to their advantage. It's so incredibly rewarding seeing the toys work together out of necessity as an unbelievably well-coordinated and unstoppable team, seeing how far they've come from their laughably dysfunctional state of existence in the first movie to now. Even in the second movie, they're still somewhat scattershot with how they come up with and put their plans into action, barely hanging on and flying by the seat of their pants all the way to the finish line, but now they're a well-oiled machine and are all very capable of improvising and adapting to situations as complications inevitably start to arise. Toy Story 3's ensemble cast structure exists because the story is about unifying the family and bonding them together as one during such a tumultuous period of change in their lives, and that's what this prison break sequence proves more than anything. How much they've bonded over the years and how well they've learned to work together, and I love how they chose to divvy up the toys for each element of this escape. First, obviously, you would pair up Barbie and Ken. That one's a no-brainer. Then there's Woody and Slink, being two characters with among the longest-standing friendships as shown by the beginning of the first movie, who are in charge of the heist to take out the monkey. Ham and Rex, who have always been at each other's throats, use that to their advantage to distract Buzz while the Roundup gang, who have pre-existing chemistry, work together to trap him, and then Ham and Rex use their combined weight to ensure he remains trapped. And any additional resources used are all things you would believably find inside a daycare, such as a bag of marbles, can't remember these things, or a kid's lunchbox. Whether this tortilla was simply left behind, or the toys went out of their way to keep it for themselves for use in this escape, which I'm taking extra time to draw attention to because, more so than any other in the film, if there was any sequence that would be most severely impacted by oversights in logic, it would be this one, because concocting a complicated plan to escape a prison-like environment will inherently consist of almost exclusively logistics in order for it all to work properly. It's an extremely elaborately plotted part of Toy Story 3, with at least 4 different splinter groups of toys accomplishing very different goals at any given time, all in service of one single larger objective, all of which is predicated on you understanding exactly how the obstacles at Sunnyside work so you can feel a sense of satisfaction in seeing the toys navigate their way around them. When you have a scene like this where the characters are all working together to accomplish a big plan, there's 2 ways you can go about it. You can either lay out the specifics of what the plan is going to look like ahead of time, step by step, creating tension in the question of whether or not the characters will be able to accomplish their mission when you know exactly what's supposed to happen and what's not supposed to happen, or you can do what Toy Story 3 does and what the Mission Impossible movies often do, which is keep the audience entirely in the dark about what the specifics of the plan are going to look like, instead creating suspense from learning in the moment what the characters are up to and piecing the plan together for yourself as it unfolds in front of your eyes. I mean, not that I'd have any reason to suspect Pixar might have been inspired by the Mission Impossible movies to any degree.
I was just looking at animated films, and you can see in Toy Story 3, Woody doing the cable drop.
Yeah, that was so cool. Those guys did that. I'm very honored. Like, to see that in different ways, it's really an honor.
Anyway, I don't actually have a preference between these two, as they both have distinctly different but equally valuable effects on the audience, and it depends on what feels right for the story you want to tell. But either way, you need to make sure your escape plan is running with a consistent thread of logic and that all the pieces fall into place with what's been previously established, because the basis of a scene like this is a remarkably intelligently constructed prison system being systematically dismantled by an even smarter protagonist. So this is certainly not the time to start taking shortcuts in the logistics department, which means I will be spending an extensive amount of time deconstructing the mechanics of this prison break, minute by minute, and explaining why it all ties together so perfectly. So let's begin with the first phase of the plan, the roll call, and Potato Head's noticeable absence as he distracts the guards and the monkey long enough for Slinky to slink out of his cell, and Woody to collect him with a weighted bungee jump. One could argue it's a little bit of overkill to have Buzz, Ken, and Big Baby abandon their post to chase down Potato Head when you probably only need one of them to handle the situation, but that's what they have the monkey for. As far as they're concerned, the monkey will alert them to anything else that happens while they're momentarily preoccupied, while they devote all their forces to handling the attempted escapee, which makes even more sense when you realize this particular toy has already caused so much trouble for Lotso's crew that he's the one toy who's had to spend the only night he's been at Sunnyside in the box, which is also why the monkey is paying extra close attention to the camera trained on Potato Head, so that he's ready to sound the alarm and send in backup if Buzz's crew proves incapable of handling him. Though we should probably discuss what is arguably the biggest problem that would theoretically be created created for the toys by the existence of the monkey security camera network. How have the daycare toys not been exposed for being alive when the cameras would be recording their actions all night long? The thing is, unlike a building such as a bank, a children's daycare is not a place that people are constantly climbing over each other to break into and rob blind, and as such doesn't necessitate constant surveillance. Places like this usually have the security cameras primarily as a superficial deterrent. Things that they can check if they need to, but don't need to waste resources on hiring a full-time nighttime security guard to watch over. Sunnyside isn't exactly the most pristine location in the world, and seems to have a very limited staff as is from what we can see. So why have the cameras at all then? Well, in my experience, schools and daycares tend to only have these cameras as a placebo. When I was in high school, nobody ever checked the tapes for the security cameras unless they had a justified reason to do so. Namely, when administration started getting reports that one of the students had been smuggling firearms onto school grounds. At which point, obviously, they actually looked at the security cameras so they could verify the story and handle it accordingly before anything serious could actually happen. The point being, unless there's evidence of a break-in or some other incident that would force them to check the cameras and figure out what actually happened, the odds of the Sunnyside employees actively reviewing these tapes every single day are slim to none. And not only that, security camera footage will very often automatically overwrite if nothing happened due to there being no reason to fill up archival storage space with what the humans would believe is endless hours of nothing happening. And if there ever was an incident that would require the checking of the tapes, I don't know why we wouldn't assume Lotso's gang has the ability to erase the footage themselves given the control we already see them have over Sunnyside systems and specifically the network of cameras. Phew. Alright, I think I've covered all my bases on the subject of the security cameras and Potato Head's first little diversion. Oh, but one more thing before we move on. I love Don Rickles intentionally poorly acting out a scream of terror as Big Baby's carrying him away. Alright, that's one toy out of the caterpillar room, so next up on the agenda, getting Barbie out of there as well. That one's much easier because it clearly doesn't take too much pressure from Barbie to make Ken's wings pop out given the head over heels affection he's previously shown toward her, and she can sell her woe is me act even easier once they get into Ken's dream house by leaning into the stereotypically airheaded persona even more heavily to win Ken over and fawning over all his clothes like the most cookie-cutter teenage girl cliche you can imagine. Because remember, while Ken keeps finding new wardrobes to wrap himself up in every single scene, Barbie's been stuck wearing this exact same aerobics outfit for years. So even though she's only really interested in interrogating Ken for information about what Lotso did to Buzz and how they can switch him back, she has every reason in the world to be able to convince Ken this is something she's genuinely interested in so they have a common passion to bond over, making it all the easier for her to bat her eyes and sucker him into putting on a fashion show long enough to lull him into a sense of security and turn the tables on him. And because she was so successful in exposing his weak spot, she's able to use that against him to torture him into telling her the truth. Now, of course, it works out nicely that this is also a torture method that allows the film to remain G-rated, but it also makes complete sense with how Ken's been shown to act that he'd be more impacted by the loss of his rarest clothing items than anything else she could have done to him that would be more overtly violent. And not only does Ken's adoration of fashion aid Barbie in her interrogation methods, but once he cracks and reveals the location of Buzz's instruction manual, that same love of clothes allows the bookworm to not be remotely suspicious when Barbie goes to retrieve it, and he sees who he believes to be Ken wearing high heels because of course he'd be trying on whatever crazy apparel he wanted to with no concern for what anyone else thought. And good for him, honestly. It also helps that we know from earlier the rest of Lotso's crew considers Ken to be
a girl's toy.
I'm not a girl's toy! I'm not!
That, and also the fact that by wearing an astronaut outfit with a helmet like this, that's obviously going to muffle Barbie's voice somewhat when she asks for the manual and make it much tougher for the bookworm to sense that something's amiss here. Also, it seems like she might have literally had to drag him out of bed over this.
I don't know why this couldn't wait until morning, Ken.
And most people I know aren't exactly at their most alert right when they wake up. And none of these shenanigans would ever catch the monkey's attention because by this point, Woody and Slink will have already knocked his lights out, slowly coiling their way down and preparing to swing over and decommission him. It might seem like a bit of an oversight to leave the linchpin of your operation entirely unguarded in the security office, but as we see soon enough... The monkey is not some weak and vulnerable glass cannon toy who can be effortlessly dispatched, and I don't believe anybody could have snuck up on him even if they were completely and totally silent, which, to be fair, Woody and Slink weren't. They came close, and they tried their best to be stealthy, but no matter how hard you try, you can't mask the springy noise of Slinky's coil. And once he knows you're there, he does not go down without a fight. In fact, he's probably the most capable fighter Lotso has on his side apart from Buzz, whose priority is obviously to guard the actual prisoners. Brief as it may be, the battle between Woody's cowboy lasso skills and the monkey's unpredictable combat capabilities as they race for the microphone is so gripping to watch, with how frantically they bounce across the room and how the power dynamic shifts back and forth in such a short period of time. Once he's all tied up and locked away, Slink signals back to the caterpillar room that they're clear to go on to the next phase, which is neutralizing Buzz. Because of course they couldn't do something like that while the monkey was still keeping a keen eye on their every move. Now, this part relies on Ham and Rex being in the same cell so they can get into a hilariously faked fight. Buzz can pull them out of the cell to try to break up the fight, distracting him long enough for Jesse and Bullseye to get out of their cells, and then they can bait him over to the perfect spot for the Roundup gang to trap him. It might appear that Woody got lucky again that Lotso's guards ended up putting these two in the same cell, but we know they couldn't have been the ones to do it, because if they were, then they'd have noticed immediately that Potato Head had been replaced by an actual potato while they were doing that, and he never would have gotten this far. The follow-up question to this is why the toys are even allowed to pick their cells when Lotso's dictatorship is about ensuring they have absolutely zero freedom in their day-to-day lives. Thing is, they're not cells. They serve that role for Lotso's purposes, but in reality, they're just storage bins, as in containers daycare employees may use to put away toys at the end of the day, which clearly isn't something they always do, but we can see before their first night of lockup, there were other play items already stored away in the bins. And if it's established they will sometimes do this, it gives the toys all the plausible deniability in the world to claim this was just how the humans left them before they all went home for the day, regardless of whether that's true or not, giving them the perfect cover to ensure all the toys are in the exact cells they need to be for this plan to work. Especially because Ham and Rex weren't the only toys to switch cells, as all of them are somewhere different from where they were the previous night, so these two wouldn't stand out as being particularly suspicious, and because they already established a precedent of allowing multiple toys to be in the same cell when they chucked all three aliens into one and were about to put the two potato heads into another before one of them acted up and got sent to the box. And yes, it absolutely was necessary for Buzz to pull the toys out of the cell to break up the fight, because there's nothing he can do from the outside except yell at them, I guess, but that clearly wasn't going anywhere. Additionally, Ham is a piggy bank and is therefore a lot more fragile than the other toys, so if Lotso wants everybody to be intact for the Caterpillar Room kids to play with, then Buzz needs to ensure the toys are not substantially damaged during the fight. He wasn't left with many choices in this situation, but like Buzz always does, he'll choose the smartest course of action he has available to him, much like when he first gets trapped under the bin and without hesitation tries to use his laser to cut a hole in the side. It obviously doesn't work, and we knew it never would because it's just a light bulb, but given Buzz's current understanding of the world around him, he has every reason to believe it would've, and so continues the trend of Buzz intelligently utilizing his resources to the best of his ability. Regardless, it's a fruitless endeavor. And with both the monkey and Buzz out of commission, the only obstacle now standing in the toys' way is to unlock the door and get across the playground. But to do that, they first have to take care of their Idaho pal who took a trip to the box. Because this wasn't just a stunt to distract the guards to allow Woody's plan to be set in motion, Potato Head also needed to be out there to sneak over to the butterfly room and peek in from the outside to determine if the coast was clear and they were safe to move out. And that's part of the brilliance of Woody's plan. Everybody's role serves more than one purpose in the larger picture, and all of those purposes beautifully intertwine together. Potato Head starts the domino chain and acts as butterfly room surveillance to allow Jesse's crew to sneak across the playground, which can only be done after Woody and Slink disable the monkey and obtain the key in that office, removing the cameras from the playing field and allowing the Roundup gang to disable Buzz and send Potato Head a new body to possess, all while Barbie single-handedly restrains Ken and uses him to obtain Buzz's instruction manual, then leaving it up to the toys still inside to restore him back to normal, at which point everyone can reunite and make one last break for the exit. I can't express to you how much I love watching this part of the movie because of how exceptionally clever this plan is and how delightfully entertaining it is to watch it all unfold and seeing how the toys have to account for unforeseen obstacles along the way. I'm also presenting these events to you slightly out of order in a way that makes it easier for me to break down the logistics of the sequence, but when watching the actual movie, you are constantly jumping back and forth between all these different concurrent storylines to make things feel like they're moving as fast as possible and never leave you with one set of characters for too long, which helps this sequence not feel overly drawn out or like the story is treading water when it very easily could've. Speaking of unforeseen obstacles, though, let's check back in with Mr. Potato Head, seeing as I kinda just glossed over the whole possessing a new body thing, because he may have been taken to the box and rendered incapable of lifting the top off to escape, but he doesn't need to get his whole body out. He just needs to get his parts out because we know they can all still function on their own, most of the time. All he has to do is throw them all through the drain hole, and then once all his other pieces are outside, he can use the autonomous mobility his arms are capable of to move out of the box by themselves. Because, as you'll notice if you pay close enough attention, his arms are the very last pieces to fall out of the box. See guys? Sometimes when you slow movies down and go frame by frame, you'll be impressed by these kinds of little details instead of unbearably frustrated. And it's naturally going to be a lot harder to detect a bunch of smaller individual pieces sneaking through the shadows of the playground than it would be if he tried to move across in his original, larger potato form. Now all he has to do is stick his parts into the tortilla Jesse provided for him, and thus, Mr. Tortilla Head is born. And it's kinda terrifying if I'm being honest, seeing his arm grab onto the tortilla and drag it into the shadows before the army of potato parts emerges out of the darkness to inhabit it for themselves. But it's also a clever callback to the first movie because the unconventional arrangement of the parts on his face is akin to Picasso's signature cubist art style, just like how he referred to himself during his introduction.
Look, I'm Picasso!
I don't get it.
I also really love the floppy animation as he navigates the world as a tortilla, especially with how his hat behaves as he flings himself up this tricycle to get a peek inside the butterfly room. Once he verifies Lotso and his friends are sound asleep, he signals back to the caterpillar room that they're clear to make a break for it. Courtesy of the key, Woody and Slink slingshot it over to Jesse, utilizing Bullseye's services as a horse to prevent the aliens from squeaking as they move, as well as generally simplifying the navigation process. Oh, and while we're in this part of the movie, to the people who ask the question, why don't the toys just break the windows so they don't have to worry about finagling their way around locked doors? Well, one, if your goal is to stay under the radar and avoid detection, shattering the glass windows is probably the worst possible thing you can do. Anyway, one uncomfortably close call with a pigeon later, and now it's time for our splinter groups to start coming back together to fix Buzz. But Ham and Rex make a fatal error. Both of them walk toward one end of the bin out of excitement from seeing Woody return, only for Buzz, smart as he always has been, to instantly pounce on their mistake and use the offset and weight distribution to break free from the bin and charge towards the exit before being comically tackled by Ham and Rex. Another perfect indicator of how delicately Toy Story 3 balances its comedy and drama, taking a second after Potato Head's harrowing pigeon battle to relieve the audience's stress with a bit of banter between Buzz, Ham, and Rex.
I said no one can hear you.
What? He said no one can. Just you be quiet.
But then leverages that sense of security they've pulled you into to enhance the dramatic effect of Buzz breaking free, raising your stress levels even higher than they otherwise would have been, which also tees you up nicely for the stress reliever of that slapstick tackle to hit your funny bone even harder, as well as leading into what is arguably the single funniest thing in the entire movie.
Bitácora Espacial.
Spanish Buzz. The unfortunate result of Woody and the gang trying to reset Buzz while simultaneously trying to restrain him, and inadvertently changing his speaking language to Spanish, which, much like his demo switch earlier, makes complete sense. They activated a different language setting because they didn't read all the instructions in the limited time they had to work with. Reset buttons are super common so that in case a toy starts to malfunction, you can shut it down and start with a clean slate without having to forcibly eject the batteries. Or even just to reset simple circuitry if he ever starts to glitch for any reason, like if his voice commands were to freeze or stutter mid-sentence. And that there would even be a Spanish mode at all is completely believable given that Spanish is the second most spoken language and the most commonly learned language in the United States, with there being tens of millions of people who speak Spanish here, so it follows that a toy would have this kind of setting rather than making multiple versions of a toy for different countries.
We gotta switch him back.
Well, how do we do that?
I don't know. That part's in Spanish.
That sounds like a rather worthless set of instructions, but I can virtually guarantee that if Ham read a little further ahead in the manual, he almost certainly would have found pictures the toys could use to deduce how to change Buzz back to English even if the text was only in Spanish, or a section that does explain it in English. However, this ain't a job you want to rush, and they didn't have a second to waste when escaping. The smarter choice in this situation would be to remain focused on getting out of Sunnyside and then fix him when they got home, when they would have all the time in the world to figure things out, as opposed to rushing to fix him under a strict time limit and potentially making things even worse. The important thing they needed to accomplish with this plan was getting Buzz back on their side and out of Lotso's grasp, and they at least managed to do that.
Sort of.
They can figure out the rest later. There's a lot of things that had to happen between their arrival at Sunnyside and now to get us to the Spanish Buzz payoff, but they never took any shortcuts. The writers wanted Spanish Buzz, so they put in the effort to make sure they could get him without compromising the integrity of the story. Never mind the fact that they forgot to screw his back shut again, but it still somehow closed up anyway. Now we get yet another throwback to the first movie as Buzz meets Woody with basically the exact same reaction he had the first time around, only this time he's got a bit of a Spanish flair to his behavior. The fluidity and the animation of his movements are so spectacularly satisfying to watch. Whether he's staring down Woody with a laser pointed at his forehead or gracefully trying to impress Jesse, I can think of no better word to describe it than majestic. It's yet another portrayal of Buzz that's completely unique from anything we've seen before, and from what I can tell, this joke, counterintuitively, might work even better in the Spanish dubs of Toy Story 3 than the original English version. I don't usually discuss regional differences between the media I cover. I say usually because, well, you know. It's so stupid! And the reason is because most of the time the distinction is purely linguistic and has no bearing on the story itself. It just sometimes makes the dialogue a whole lot stupider.
I will kill you in the name of deliciousness.
But here, you obviously can't just translate this scene one-to-one for Spanish-speaking countries because it wouldn't make any sense, and it can't be fixed with something as simple as swapping out an American flag for a globe, so I think it's important to talk about how this is handled internationally. And the simplest way to put it is that Buzz speaks a different dialect of Spanish depending on which country's version you're watching. For instance, the Latin American version would have Buzz start speaking in a Castilian accent from Spain, which has a very different sound to native speakers, whereas in Spain he switches to using an overly exaggerated Andalusian accent, which is home to flamenco and other behaviors Buzz inhabits in his new form. Now, I can't personally attest to this, and I encourage anyone who grew up watching these versions to share their experiences in the comments, but I've been told from people I've spoken to that the joke is just as funny, if not even funnier than the original English version, and regardless of its comedic effectiveness, the fact they actually took the time to figure out how to maintain the spirit of the joke around the world is beyond commendable. What doesn't work quite as well is the justification provided for why they can't switch Buzz back right away. Spain's version is actually fine.
Dejadlo como estaba.
¿Y cómo lo hacemos?
Yo qué sé, no vienen las instrucciones.
As it's basically the same scenario as the English version. The instructions are almost certainly there if he had the time to read further ahead, which we know he didn't. But things get a bit weirder in the Latin American dub.
Hay que arreglar a Buzz. ¿Qué dicen las instrucciones? No lo sé. Esa parte está en japonés.
Seeing as Buzz was made in Taiwan and Japanese doesn't seem to be a primary language in that country, I don't know if this really makes all that much sense as an explanation. Not to say nobody speaks Japanese in Taiwan, obviously, but wouldn't it make more sense for the instructions to be written in Taiwanese Mandarin, the official language of the country? And before you ask, I checked the first movie's Latin American dub, and while Pixar did translate certain text for international audiences, including some in that very scene, no such adjustments were made for the text written in Buzz's wrist communicator, and as we may recall from last time, the text is just gone entirely in the third movie, which either means they retcon Buzz's origins specifically for the purpose of the Latin American dub, or the manual actually wasn't written in Japanese, but Ham just assumed it had to be Japanese because he didn't understand the language. Is ham racist? But aside from this one part, the rest of the scene carried over remarkably well throughout the localization process for Spanish-speaking countries. Though since we're talking about Spanish buzz from a cultural perspective, I also feel it's important to discuss what's probably the biggest controversy I've seen Toy Story 3 fall under. Not anything mainstream. I haven't honestly seen that many people raise this issue, but I've seen enough to warrant me talking about it in this video. The idea that this portrayal of Spanish buzz is incredibly stereotypical and offensive. Now, again, I don't exactly have the authority to speak on behalf of any native Spanish speakers, as I am not one myself, and I would certainly never want to tell someone they don't have the right to feel the way they do about something of this caliber. However, judging by Leon Critch's track record with Coco, and the extensive amount of research he and his team put into making sure they authentically portrayed Mexican culture in that film,
I absolutely did feel comfortable with the film being lighthearted at times and being irreverent at times, because I knew that ultimately it was very sincere. It was very sincere, and we certainly tried to be as respectful as possible. But at the same time, there was a lot of room to have fun.
I do not genuinely believe for a second that Spanish buzz was added into this movie with anything less than the utmost respect for the culture they were portraying in Toy Story 3. Not to mention that Carlos Baena, one of the primary animators for Spanish buzz, is from Spain and worked to incorporate his culture into the movie through these scenes, on top of the team conducting research into Latin ballroom dancing, bullfighting, and flamenco dancing. I welcome discussions about this in the comments from people more familiar with the subject of whether this can be considered truly offensive or not, but in any case, I feel like I can say pretty confidently that nobody who worked on the film was genuinely trying to mock Spanish culture in any way. I adore Spanish buzz. I adore Javier Fernandez-Peña's silky smooth voice delivery, the hypnotic gracefulness to his movements, and his utterly unfiltered personality whenever he's around Jessie, as well as the subsequent jealousy that befalls him when she hugs Woody, all of which is accentuated by the sexy Latin guitar that takes over the soundtrack whenever Spanish buzz needs to step into the spotlight. And in keeping with what I was talking about last time, I really wish Pixar's marketing team had the restraint to not reveal this in the trailers, because whenever I show this movie to someone who's never seen it before, or who hasn't seen it in a long time, they always, without fail, burst out laughing as soon as the first words come out of his mouth.
Bitácora espacial.
So much. I love this so much. You have no idea how cripplingly jealous I am of the people who saw Toy Story 3 in theaters, not having been privy to any of the promotional material beforehand. I can only imagine how funny it would be to go from Buzz threatening to detonate the entire escape operation by breaking free from the bin, to being left in a worrying place of limbo as Rex holds the reset button for just a little bit too long, having absolutely no idea what he did to Buzz or what's about to happen next, and then out of fucking nowhere, he just belts out perfectly fluent Spanish. It's so good. It's such perfect comedic timing, and the best part is that it's not a one-off joke that gets immediately reversed. They commit to this bit 1000% for the entire rest of the second act and a little bit of the third as well, and it just keeps building to become more and more exaggerated and ridiculous with each subsequent scene. And I especially love that he's not just here for the gag. This Spanish mode allows Buzz to express his feelings for Jessie when he otherwise may never have found the words to be able to do so, ultimately getting one final fantastic punchline in the credits we'll talk about next time. And yeah, exaggerated is the perfect term to use to describe what this is. It's so far out beyond the stars, and is probably the most preposterous and extravagant comedic element across the entire trilogy, but in a movie where you have such extreme emotional highs and lows, things like Spanish buzz are here to help maintain a tonal balance. For every dark and twisted part of Toy Story 3 that forces the toys to confront their imminent demise on a scale far more intense than ever before, there is an equally outrageous joke waiting around the corner so you don't become completely and totally consumed by the darkness. For every tyrannical prison compound, you have a floppy tortilla doing parkour and dueling with angry birds. For every heart-stopping brush with death, you have Barbie torturing Ken in the most brand-safe way imaginable. And for every incinerator scene that leaves you teetering so far on the edge of your seat you almost somersault around it, You have a Spanish buzz that sparks a sense of bewildering laughter in all of those lucky enough to go in totally blind. A group of people which I, unfortunately, was not a part of thanks to the marketing, even if the lighting changed immensely between the trailer and final release.
Bitácora espacial. Bitácora espacial.
And so did the voice, for that matter. And his actions on the playground continue to prove that it doesn't matter what mode Buzz is in or what language he's speaking, he is still extremely competent and athletic and maintains a strong sense of justice. Unfortunately, we're gonna have to pump the brakes on the praise train here for a second because we're about to come to what is probably my personal most frustrating thing about Toy Story 3. The bucket stunt. If you've been around the channel for a few years, then you've heard me talk about this plenty of times by now, so let's just get this over with. After all the toys are finally reunited on the playground, and Mr. Cucumber Head returns to his original body, a surprise patrol truck splits the group in two and forces Woody, Bullseye, and the aliens to take a detour to reach the trash chute where they encounter Big Baby, creepily but peacefully staring out at the night sky. They try to slip past him undetected, but in stepping down a level, one of the aliens falls off of Bullseye and leaving them stuck with nowhere to run and Big Baby right on their tail, seconds away from catching them, but when he looks over, they've vanished. Or, more accurately, they've teleported beneath the bucket, which is, of course, blatantly impossible. There's simply no way they could have gotten over there and lifted up the bucket without Big Baby seeing them do any of that, even with just his one eye, and I also sorta question whether the bucket's even big enough to fit all 5 of them, but that's not as definitive of a whole. It makes no sense. It's the one glaring oversight in Toy Story 3 scripts that haunts me to this day, especially since this is the only scene in the movie where Woody and his trusty steed Bullseye get to do something together apart from when they say goodbye, and this is what they got stuck with. Cheeto May scene this is not, but thankfully it's over just as soon as it begins, as all the toys have reached their destination at the trash chute.
Come on down, but not all at once. What did he say?
I think he said all at once.
The image you have in your head when Ham says this is already funny enough, but then it gets even better when you actually see it and the tidal wave of toys piles in and clogs up the trash chute at the end. And then Spanish Buzz hits you with another joke right afterwards.
¿Dónde está mi nave?
But we don't want to get too sidetracked by the fun and games of the comedy here, because there's still one aspect of the prison break sequence we haven't covered yet. The monkey, as previously established, is the linchpin of Lotso's entire operation. If he goes down, so does everything else around him, as the toys are given total free reign of Sunnyside without having to worry about cameras anymore. So you may wonder why there isn't some sort of system in place that allows the monkey to alert the guards and reassure them he's still safe and uncompromised, so that in case his room ever gets hijacked, they'll know something is up because they will no longer be routinely receiving these signals. However, I'd actually argue there's more evidence that they were doing these check-ins than there is evidence that they weren't. Because how else can you explain this?
You lost, little doggy?
As of a few minutes ago, we saw Lotso sound asleep in the butterfly room, yet now he was somehow able to get ahead of the toys to cut off their only escape route? How could he have possibly done this when the only mistake the toys made between then and now was this little trip up with Big Baby, and he clearly has no means to communicate with Lotso from all the way out here and doesn't walk away from the encounter thinking there even was any attempted escape after investigating for himself. And even if he did have the means to communicate with Lotso, there's no way he could have rallied the troops, tortured Chatter Telephone, and then cut Slinky off in the less than 2 minutes he had to work with, especially not without the toys seeing him since they had total control of the area surrounding the trash chute. So how did Lotso discover their escape attempt? Well, he knew where the toys were going because of Chatter Telephone.
I'm sorry, cowboy. They broke me.
But how did they know to do that? There's no way for Lotso to immediately determine if the toys are still in the caterpillar room from the butterfly room unless he saw them outside through the window. But if Lotso just inconveniently woke up at the worst possible time and spotted the toys running for the trash chute, then there'd be no need to torture Chatter Telephone because he'd already know exactly where he needed to go to stop the toys. So he must have consciously chosen to head over to the caterpillar room, but then what reason would he have to go over there if he believes Buzz to have been on duty watching over the toys? The only logical explanation is he missed some sort of cue or check-in report letting Lotso know everything was okay, leading him to discover that the monkey was compromised and that the toys had escaped to the caterpillar room, thus forcing him to interrogate Chatter Telephone and get the information he needed to cut Woody off. And of course he'd think to ask him because he knows the ins and outs of this place. He saw where the toys went and knows the only way out. When he says,
"They'll never break me,"
it implies he's been on Lotso's radar for a while but couldn't actually prove he was up to anything. Until this massive breakout happened, in which case it became immediately apparent who was responsible for helping orchestrate it. As for how he's physically able to outpace them, considering Lotso has trucks he can use to navigate the daycare and the other toys were stuck being on foot and encountered several setbacks in between when we saw him sleeping and the time they reached the dumpster, on top of the perpetual setback of having to move slowly and precisely to avoid Lotso's guards, he would have had plenty of time to cut them off. And given that they have the run of the place, locked doors have never posed a problem for them. Which now leads us to the last stand at the dumpster, the face-off between our heroes and our villains, and where we finally get the full picture of how Lotso perceives the world around him. The main reason he works so well as the final villain of this trilogy isn't just because he's the most ferociously terrifying and malicious opponent the toys have ever needed to conquer. It's because he's the plush personification of the darkest version of Woody. Some people don't believe that to be the case, and they think Lotso is just yet another standard villain, but that couldn't be further from the truth. They both at one point held the title of being their child's favorite toy while wrestling with their fears of abandonment, and Lotso is an amplification of Woody's fear from the first movie of being replaced. Woody and Lotso once both shared the same fundamental desire of being devoutly committed to a kid above all else, and whose lives both got uprooted, jeopardizing that relationship. But Lotso took the wrong path forward. They were both accidentally left behind by their owners, but Woody never gave up on Andy, while Lotso did give up on Daisy, having braved the great unknown, fighting tooth and nail, trying to get home, only to discover he'd been replaced, feeling threatened by this new toy who seems to have entirely supplanted his position in the life of that child. Like Woody did once upon a time, something snapped inside him. But Woody developed past those insecurities and worked to put other people before himself, remaining loyal to his friends and his kid to the bitter end, while Lotso took away the exact opposite lesson from his experiences. Much like how Jessie was abandoned by her owner but didn't let her trauma define who she was and worked to move past it, while Lotso let it consume him completely. Lotso projected those feelings of worthlessness onto everybody around him after being replaced, seeking to make everyone else feel like they're below him just so he can feel more important. He makes other toys believe that the fate he met would befall all of them as well unless they followed his lead. And by deeming everybody as being weak and disposable, it allows him to escape any feeling of guilt or responsibility for how he treats them and the horrors he subjects them to, both by the toddler's hand and his own, especially for Big Baby and Chuckles. There's no reason at all why those two couldn't have gone back to Daisy, because Lotso was the only toy she actually replaced. From Lotso's perspective, if the three of them showed up at her doorstep, Daisy likely would have been overjoyed to have found Big Baby and Chuckles again, because she did love all three of them, but she'd have no reason to take in the crusty old Lotso bear when she has a shiny brand new one with a much fresher strawberry scent and whose fabric wasn't drenched by the rainstorm. Lotso understood perfectly well that Big Baby and Chuckles still had a place there with her, but he's unwilling to let anybody else have something he can't, championing the idea that if Daisy replaced Lotso so easily, then she could replace them all, and so could every other kid with every other toy. He forced Big Baby to abandon a child he saw as being a mother figure to him, all because of his fragile sense of pride. The best thing about Lotso's backstory is that it allows the audience to understand perfectly well exactly why Lotso believes what he does, and maybe even empathize with him to a certain extent for what happened so long ago, without that sordid past ever being twisted into an excuse or justification for his actions. And the delicious irony in all of this is that Daisy replacing Lotso but not the other two toys really means he was the one she loved the most of the three, because humans don't know they're replacing sentient beings. It's possible Daisy was never the wiser for what really happened, and her parents bought her a new Lotso surreptitiously without her ever finding out that she lost her Lotso, or that her parents lied and said they found him when in fact they straight up replaced him. But whatever circumstances resulted in a new toy being purchased, it was all because everyone understood Lotso was the one toy of these three that Daisy desperately wanted to have by her side again, and his emotions completely took over that rationale. We're able to understand how much Daisy loved Lotso because we're third-party observers seeing things from an unbiased perspective, whereas Lotso was right there in the heat of the moment, dealing with having his home uprooted in an instant. Having his world shattered to pieces leads him to immediately assume the worst about Daisy's intentions and fundamentally shift his perspective on life. He lies to himself to cope with his abandonment, telling himself that he was never loved to begin with and refusing to allow himself to form that connection with another kid so he never has to risk feeling the same loss. To a human, replacing a toy is no different than replacing a chair or a desk. But to a toy, that's your whole livelihood that has just been ripped away. The owner with whom you forged a relationship that drove your entire existence. The place you could call a home. All the memories made and the comfort brought by being with her every day was gone. And if Daisy was willing to throw all that away so easily, then it must mean the love she had for him was never real. It was purely a transactional relationship destined to inevitably expire at some point, so to let yourself get suckered into such a connection is to set yourself up for nothing but failure and disappointment. All of which informs his rule over Sunnyside and every decision he makes from here on out. The daycare is so appealing to Lotso because he gets to reap all the rewards without any of the risks. This situation with Daisy was beyond his control, so as soon as he arrives at Sunnyside, he assembles a gang of strong toys and rigs the system so that he'll always be in control of everything and everyone, and he'll always be played with by the Butterfly Room kids no matter what, condemning other toys to torture at the hands of the toddlers no matter how inappropriate they are for children of that age, when if there was ever a toy best suited to be played with by a toddler, it would be a cuddly stuffed bear like Lotso. Some ask what Lotso has to lose by letting other toys join him in the Butterfly Room, and while the logical plot reason behind that is because Lotso fears if they don't have enough toys in the Caterpillar Room, then he'll be moved in there and be forced to play with the toddlers, the more character-motivated reason is because he needs control over the toys, and he wants to make sure he gets love from a kid, no matter what. At all costs. He must always be loved. He needs total control over his life to maximize his happiness, and it doesn't matter who he has to steamroll to get there.
We're masters of our own fate. We control our own destiny.
But there's still more to Lotso than just having control over others. He's put himself on top of the pyramid of Sunnyside, so other people are forced to depend on him for love, safety, and security, which is everything he lost after being replaced by Daisy. Lotso refuses to let his life be worse than the other toys, claiming everyone was replaced rather than just him to drag them down to his level, subjecting other toys to indefinite residence in the Caterpillar Room to feel the same crushing pain externally that devoured him whole internally, trapping the toys in an endless cycle of misery where their only means of relief and escape are if they're destroyed during a playtime or are otherwise thrown out. There isn't even an inevitable death waiting for the toys they can look to as an escape from the pain because toys don't die of old age. And Lotso also makes them doubt the connection between kids and their toys, which also leads to them doubting their own worth, making them easier to manipulate. Easier to convince that one day they could earn his respect if they suffer through enough torture and could possibly even stand by Lotso's side. You, as the audience, understand how Lotso's really manipulating and abusing these toys, but everyone in the butterfly room is still supportive of him, including toys who we know previously tried to escape from the caterpillar room, because it's so ingrained into their mindset that this is simply how things are. All their dreams for happiness rest entirely on Lotso's shoulders, a character with the charm and charisma to appeal to people's hearts, as well as the intelligence and ruthlessness to keep the toys in line whenever harsh punishment is necessary to reinforce his position of power. And someone who pretends to be lovable and endearing is far more terrifying than a villain everyone knows is evil at face value, whose eyes are everywhere, both through the minions he uses as meat shields and the cameras they operate, so you always feel his presence in the room whether he's on screen or not, who has so much more nuance to his personality and beliefs than simply being some random asshole, and who makes Sunnyside Daycare serve a greater role in the story than just to be an immaculately designed prison complex setting the stage for a daring escape. It proposed a solution to the abandonment the toys had feared, a paradise where they'll always be loved and provided for, directly challenging their dreams of the future by having Lotso serve as the counterpoint representative for how not to handle abandonment, mirroring the insecurities of Andy's toys and acting as a potent example of what happens when you allow your previous traumatic experiences and fears to overtake you and the way in which you view the world around you. As for where Woody was keeping this thing the entire time, I got no idea. Dude's got hammer space inventory, I guess. They usually account for how toys move objects from one place to another, so what happened here? Oh well. Interestingly enough, for most of this confrontation, the other toys kinda lie low and let Woody lead the sole charge against Lotso once he reveals this locket, which could result in the scene feeling too lopsided towards Woody, leaving everyone else in the dust, but it doesn't, because the reason they don't speak here is they don't have any context for the situation Woody's referring to. This is solely between him and Lotso, whereas they do have the other toys speak up quite aggressively prior to this point. And amidst this terrifically tense showdown at the dumpster with all our major characters, it's surprisingly Barbie and Ken who shine the brightest among the pack, each of them continuing to represent exactly what makes their portrayal in this movie so great.
Authority should derive from the consent of the governed, not from the threat of force.
Further showing that there's more to her character than the stereotypical blonde trope, and when Lotso orders Stretch to shove the toys into the dumpster, Ken comes racing to his side, begging and pleading with him not to do this, not because he's swayed by Barbie's beauty, viewing her as just another Barbie doll or as an object to be discarded when she's no longer of use to him. He loves this Barbie for who she is. This Barbie is the one to give him the wake-up call he needed. He was always the odd one out among Lotso's crewmates, the one belittled as being a girl's toy and whose interests were dismissed as unimportant, the one whose mobility and abilities were limited compared to the dexterity or brute strength or sheer palpable terror offered by the others, and the one who had everything he could ever need but nobody to share that happiness with. He didn't turn to the good side because Lotso finally threw him away. He turned because someone he cared about dearly was put in front of his crosshairs, which allowed him to see the world clearly and understand the severity of what he was helping do to these toys. And also because he felt lonely under Lotso's domain. So he tries to provide a voice of reason for the rest of his fellow henchmen, but it's not enough. Lotso has too firm of a grip on them. This whole scene falls right in line with what I was talking about earlier. It's all one big performance as Lotso makes an example of Andy's toys to show what happens if you step out of line, the intensity of which is made even more visceral with the knowledge that the trash truck is right down the street, just a few short stops away from cutting this conversation short and forcing the toys into an eternal hellscape whether they like it or not. It's about the fear he instills into the toys, both ones on his side and ones who aren't, intimidating them into silence so they're too afraid to speak up against him. And you can see in how Spark and Twitch glance at each other after Ken speaks that they're starting to have doubts as well. But nobody wants to actually say anything and risk challenging Lotso. Nobody, except Big Baby. After Woody presents Daisy's locket and unveils a secret Lotso had long kept hidden from his minions, providing a physical and inescapable reminder of the life that Big Baby shared with someone he considered to be his it reveals a crack in Lotso's hardened exterior, and Woody continues to expand it by pressing him on his past, and Big Baby starts to break down, which pushes Lotso over the edge, and he finally snaps in one unfettered burst of venomous rage he'd been holding back for years. Being reminded of his memory of Daisy reaches a part of him he tried so hard to suppress, and his emotions completely take over. The exact same thing that caused him to snap the first time. It's only the betrayal he feels out of his love for Daisy that can force him to this extreme. That, and the feeling that he's losing his grasp over his Sunnyside crew. That he's losing his sense of control, which he finally does as Big Baby yanks the rug out from under him. Remember when I mentioned the two-faced nature of Big Baby about 2 hours ago? There was a reason for that, and it wasn't just his multifaceted aesthetics, because at his core, he is a wholly innocent character who simply follows the word of those he trusts most. He's consistently framed as an evil being because of the situations he's in and how the other toys perceive him as just being another member of Lotso's gang, but he never has any malicious motivation in any scene he's in. Just a few moments ago on the playground, the ominous music, the sound cues in conjunction with animation and lighting, and the stakes of the situation make him seem terrifying, but from his perspective, in this scene, he was just relaxing on the swing set, staring up at the moon in what could potentially have been a somber moment of reflection about a long-lost connection, before hearing a noise and chasing after it accordingly out of curiosity. He was always the purest member of the group, which is why the other henchmen react with such guttural shock when Lotso assaults and belittles him in front of everyone. It's not like they're unaware what they're doing is wrong and have been wowed by the power of everyone's heroic words, but this moment allows them to see exactly how unhinged Lotso is. They are seeing in no uncertain terms just how little he valued them as part of his team, and that at the end of the day, Lotso is out for himself above all else, before Big Baby finally turns on Lotso and condemns him to the very fate he was just preaching about only after he disrespects Daisy, snapping him out of his belief that Lotso ingrained into him that he was worthless because the one thing he knows for sure is that Daisy wasn't worthless. And if he was wrong about her, then he was wrong about everything else that came out of his mouth ever since he spiraled out of control after that fateful night. Big Baby is the one who was most personally hurt by the lies Lotso told, so it's only right that he's the one who gets to overthrow him and toss him down into the garbage where he belongs.
He's gone. Holy cow.
But he's just a clone of Stinky Pete, I hear you say. They're both older, seemingly kind-hearted gentlemen with a cane who are ultimately revealed to be the twist villain and are chasing a utopian alternative to the inevitable heartbreak that comes with human connection. As I'm sure you are well aware, this idea of certain elements of Toy Story 3, or even the entire movie simply being a clone of Toy Story 2 is, without a doubt, the most prevalent and persistently vexing problem people tend to bring up about this film by a landslide. Which is really strange to me because the idea that Toy Story 2 and 3's villains serve the same purpose as each other is also by far the most egregiously inaccurate example out of all the evidence people use when making a wider argument of the latter copying the former. If you can manage to look past the most superficial, surface-level details, it quickly becomes apparent that they are actually the polar opposite of each other. The Prospector was
Mint in the box. Never been opened.
Nobody ever wanted to buy him. He never got played with at any point in his life, and therefore he has no way of understanding what it means for a toy to bond with their child. He literally could not fathom what that would feel like for them. He had a very clinical, one-track mind of securing his place at the museum and being preserved for all of eternity, feeling entirely indifferent towards the people he had to hurt to get to that point. Lotso, meanwhile, is driven by the desire to always be lovingly played with, and goes out of his way to cause suffering and pain to others. There was no materialistic endgame Lotso was chasing after, unlike the Prospector, who had his sights set on the Kanishi Toy Museum. He just got a twisted sense of satisfaction out of his reign at Sunnyside. Also, unlike the Prospector, Lotso's motivations are wholly selfish. His regime at Sunnyside is built from the ground up to ensure he's always in a better position than the people around him because he understands how wonderful it feels for a toy to be played with by a kid. Even though he fundamentally believes that love is fabricated on the part of the kid, that doesn't matter to him because he's still basking in the glory of how it feels to be in the moment. He sees the kids at the daycare as being equally as valueless to him as the toys, not as people with lives, but merely beings who exist to fulfill his desires without there ever being any genuine connections. And he doesn't want anyone else who isn't devoutly committed to him to ever feel that happiness again, so he can desperately cling to some scrap of self-importance. Inversely, there's nothing Stinky Pete asks of the Roundup gang that he wouldn't be willing to do himself. Everything he wants for Woody is just what he wants for himself. He believes wholeheartedly that the museum is the best possible endgame scenario for him and all toys alike, because while he does think that being owned by a kid would be living hell for a toy, he still understands that children do have an appreciation for toys which they would get to experience from being on display at a museum, and he truly believes he is in pursuit of the best possible outcome for the Roundup gang in spite of the extreme and violent measures he takes to accomplish that. To the Prospector, Woody is nothing but a means to an end. When he rips Woody's arm at the airport, he does so as a strictly pragmatic decision, knowing Al could get him fixed again and is just taking advantage of that fact to get Woody back in the suitcase. But to Lotso, the toys toppling his empire is personal, and his choice to leave them for dead in the incinerator is an emotional act of revenge. One is a more personal manipulator, whereas the other gets his way through intimidation and fascistic fear tactics. But no, they're both old, they both have a cane, and they're both technically twist villains, so I guess that means they're exactly the same. Even though Lotso is a much more present villain for Toy Story 3 because he's revealed relatively early on, whereas they hold on to the Prospector reveal until the third act, but who cares about context, am I right? And I would once again like to reiterate, I am not arguing in favor of either Toy Story 2 or 3 when I break these two characters down. I am simply interested in drawing the line between them to establish that they are absolutely not the same, and that both Stinky Pete and Lotso are excellent and narratively distinct villains that work perfectly for their respective stories. And that's really just a microcosm of the wider problem here. The argument that Toy Story 3 is a complete rehash of Toy Story 2 because of a laundry list of surface-level similarities, like they both open with a large-scale action sequence that's ultimately revealed to be an exaggeration of something fictitious. They both tackle the themes of mortality, change, and the idea that toys don't last forever. Both plots are kicked into motion by unwanted toys being gathered up outside and the main character ending up in the same location as those unwanted toys, at which point said main character winds up in a totally new environment with new characters and a twist villain. A delusional Buzz Lightyear locks up the main characters. There's an oversaturated flashback sequence involving abandonment, and the grand finale is a massive industrial contraption that results in the main villain being defeated and placed in the hands of an owner who has no care for their well-being. Now, I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I think that's a perfectly reasonable and fair summation of the events of these two films, which does not at all omit any context in order to make the arguments seem more reasonable than they actually are. I mean, it's not like there's an enormous difference between making peace with the concept of mortality and actually having to confront your mortality head-on when that moment finally arrives. It's not like saying the characters arrive in a new location with lots of new characters is such a laughable piece of evidence to use use when arguing two movies have practically identical plots, as if the very idea of arriving somewhere new is itself some unforgivable sin. And Al's apartment as a new location is not inherently that interesting, and it's the drama that unfolds between the characters that's appealing, whereas the layout and backstory of Sunnyside directly play into the story alongside the compelling character drama. It's not like the Buzz opening consists of very specific setups for very specific payoffs that will happen in the future, with sneaking through the vents en route to Al's apartment being akin to Buzz's assault on Zurg's fortress, and the climactic battle against Zurg himself allowing Rex to finally accomplish in the real world what he never could in the virtual one, while the balls-to-the-walls fun western opening of Toy Story 3 instead looks to the past to call back to the earliest moments of playtime for the toys. It's not like you can't even begin to compare an adrenaline-fueled epic chase across the streets and through the inner workings of an airport to rescue Woody, where even though the toys are so small in the grand scheme of things, you still have everyone triumphantly taking charge and grabbing the danger by the reins to get everyone home safely, to a dire scramble for survival as it feels like the whole world is literally crumbling all around them as they can barely manage to cling on to life as they stumble their way over every obstacle thrown their way before ultimately being left with no options to the point of being forced to accept their death together as a family. It's also not like, yeah, no, I can't even pretend like this makes any sense at all. This argument holds absolutely no water whatsoever when you actually examine these two stories, and I'm so sick of seeing it be accepted as fact by some people, which is why I've spent so much time highlighting the critical contextual distinctions between things like the inclusion of a delusional Buzz, or the action set-piece opening sequence, or the villain, so I can at least attempt to repair the damage that was dealt to Toy Story 3 discourse when this criticism was first brought up over a decade ago, where people say that if you love Toy Story 3, what you secretly actually love is Toy Story 2 due to it just being a carbon copy of that movie. In order to make this argument, you have to be so ludicrously dishonest in how you represent these films, it's not even funny. When someone edits clips together that appear identical at first glance while pairing them with leading and omissive narration, it can very much seem like an open and shut case to any unassuming viewers, or people who haven't seen either movie in a while, or at all, but that's all they are. Surface level similarities, some of which, if you'll recall, are things like characters are taken to a new location with a twist villain. It's like if I said, to name a totally random example, that The Lion King was nothing but a cheap ripoff of pre-1994 Kimba the White Lion content because their names are similar and they both have comic relief warthogs and angry bird sidekicks and villains with dark fur and a wounded left eye and themes about environmentalism and love interests and arcs for the main character about maturing into a confident ruler of the jungle. You know, fragmented surface-level similarities which immediately crumble to anybody who has actually watched and is paying attention to both pieces of media. Or if I said that The Matrix and the Lego Movie are actually the exact same film and Lord Miller totally ripped off the Wachowskis because they're both stories about a socially outcasted nerd going about their lives in what they believe to be a normal world but is actually a dystopian hellscape that will eventually bring about an apocalyptic doomsday, and who is believed to be the special chosen one, prophesies to save them all, and subsequently teams up with a super cool woman whose competence far exceeds that of his own, undergoing psychological training in the hopes of rising up against the evil overlords and robotic sentinel army, only to ultimately result in the most important members of the resistance being restrained and held hostage for brainwashing before finally having a moment for the hero to come into his own and prove he is more than worthy of being the special person the prophecy spoke of. And also, they both got really, really terrible sequels. Now I ask you, is that a fair and honest summation of the Lego Movie and The Matrix? No, of course it isn't. That's the point. In case it isn't clear, I am not legitimately arguing that the Lego Movie ripped off The Matrix or that The Lion King ripped off Kimba. These are obviously absurd comparisons to make, and if you want to learn more on the Kimba front, you should check out this absolutely fantastic video on the topic made by YMS. I sincerely mean it when I say this is one of the best videos I've ever seen on YouTube, and I cannot possibly recommend it enough if you haven't already seen it because it goes into an extensive amount of detail and is armed to the teeth with countless supporting references about just how flimsy the accusations against The Lion King really are, and about how you don't get the same viewing experience from these two works of art, and that if you ignore all surrounding context and reduce their respective plot elements down to single-sentence descriptions, then yeah, You can make them sound pretty damn similar. I had to leave out a tremendous amount of context in order to summarize these two movies the way that I did, which is also what you have to do in order to argue that The Lion King ripped off Kimba, or that Toy Story 3 is a carbon copy of Toy Story 2. Even though you can very easily cherry-pick similarities between films such as The Lego Movie and The Matrix, you can't honestly argue that they are just the same story with different coats of paint, because the circumstances of both films, the experience of watching both films, and the messages the writers wanted to get across to their audiences with both films couldn't be more dissimilar from one another. Though they may have a very similar premise, they end up focusing on separate elements that make each movie unique. And it's why I would even be willing to defend Cars against the accusation that it plagiarized Doc Hollywood, because even though it is inarguable that the two plots share a disturbing amount of overlap beyond the surface level, and I actually find it impossible to believe that Pixar just accidentally wrote a movie with such broad similarities given how weirdly specific this premise is, I also find it impossible to believe that someone could watch these two movies in their entirety and conclude that Cars is nothing but a shameless ripoff with nothing original to contribute, nothing unique to say, and nothing about its story that sets it apart from Doc Hollywood. But when you strip stories down to their skeletal structures and leave out all context surrounding each of those individual plot points that makes them categorically and demonstrably distinct from one another, you can describe just about any two movies in a way that makes them seem like carbon copies of each other. Vague, reductive plot summaries are not reflective of the things that make a story successful and resonant. People didn't love The Matrix for the same reasons they loved the Lego Movie. People didn't love... Well, Doc Hollywood has very different strengths than Cars does, and in terms of character and thematics, Toy Story 3 is not an explicit retread of old ground covered in Toy Story 2. For instance, the second movie places a far greater emphasis on the concept of value and self-worth, something Woody clearly lacks in the beginning of the story as he's frantically searching for his hat, believing Andy wouldn't want to take him to cowboy camp without it, and something which he and Jessie both embrace by the end, no longer needing to cling on to the path that was already written into stone for them or the words of a manipulative prospector just to give their lives meaning, but forging their own paths to happiness, with Woody understanding that the only one who can decide whether he still has value after Andy grows up is himself. That is an idea that is almost entirely exclusive to Toy Story 2, and when it comes to the thematic elements that do have more explicit overlap, Toy Story 3 just expands on what Toy Story 2 set up, which is what makes it such a great sequel and helps the trilogy feel like one huge story that was planned from the get-go, with one exploring the idea of facing your mortality, the question of how you can enjoy life when nothing in life lasts forever, and ultimately concluding that just because you know a song's gonna end at some point, that's no reason not to listen to it in the moment, while the sequel brings that conflict to its logical endpoint by confronting the inevitability Stinky Pete prophesized.
You'll all be ruined, forgotten, spending eternity rotting in some landfill,
and exploring what their lives are going to look like when the needle lifts for the last time. The world doesn't expand in the same way either, because a toy store, apartment, and airport serve different functions than a daycare and a landfill, which are both thematically bountiful places for a story about toys to be set. And narratively, Toy Story 2 is split into two halves with an intimate character study in Woody's story and a high-octane comic relief rescue mission in Buzz's story, while Toy Story 3 is primarily an ensemble story that keeps the family together for most of the movie and focuses on their combined journey and experiences with Andy. And a decent chunk of Toy Story 3's second act is this elaborate prison break sequence for which there is no such counterpart in Toy Story 2. Do you see what I mean now? Because, like, I'm kind of running out of ways to say that Toy Story 3 is not a rehash of Toy Story 2. The stories aren't the same, the character arcs aren't the same, they do not offer you the same viewing experience with a different coat of paint beyond certain reductive comparisons, all of which are dramatically outweighed by their numerous differences. But of course, those would get in the way of the narrative that's being spun, so we wouldn't ever want to call attention to them. And there's an awfully annoying amount of irony in people saying, you all took this movie at face value without actually thinking about it because they dangled your childhood childhood heroes in front of your face, only for people to then go on to take the incredibly slapdash arguments that the two movies are the same at face value, because as soon as you actually take the time to break down these two stories, it becomes abundantly clear that they serve very distinct purposes. In case you can't tell, I've been wanting to get that off my chest for quite a while now. But hey, while I'm knocking down criticisms, can we please talk about the alien getting stuck in the dumpster? So many people declare it as being a complete impossibility for the alien to have gotten stuck or for Lotso to have grabbed Woody's ankle from all the way down at the bottom of the dumpster, but it just isn't. If Lotso was able to reach Woody's leg, then he also could absolutely have reached the top of the dumpster to open the door enough for the alien to stumble and get himself caught. He only needs to pop it open for not even a second for this to work, which he can do by jumping up to nudge it open, thus getting the alien stuck. Then he has to jump up again to grab Woody's ankle, and once that happens, it's over. Gravity will do the rest in sucking him back down, which, considering the options he had available to him, that being to either stack the garbage up in one single concentrated position high enough to be able to reach the lid, which we can see when it's emptied into the truck, there absolutely would have been enough to be able to do that, or simply use the metal ridges lining the sides of the dumpster as a means of giving him a boost, which, judging from what's shown to us in this movie, would put him very close to the roof of the dumpster, is entirely plausible. I don't even blame people for thinking it's a bit of a stretch that Lotso was able to do all this with such perfect precision and in such little time, because a lot of stuff happens in an incredibly short period of time that turns the entire situation on its head and turns what was a straightforward, easy victory into an absolute worst-case scenario where all of Andy's toys are now racing toward the very landfill they've been dreading for years. But the pieces are there to explain how Lotso could have pulled this off. A stretch? Perhaps. But an impossibility? Not even slightly. And with that, my friends, I'm afraid we're going to have to call it off right here for today. I know, it's diabolical of me to leave things off right when we're on the cusp of the film's grand finale. But the third act of Toy Story 3 is so immaculately crafted, so deliberately and intelligently paced, and so overwhelmingly emotional, it deserves its own separate video to cover it all in as much detail as possible. And I promise it'll be worth the wait. It's gonna be an enormous 2-hour-long finale diving into absolutely everything Act 3 has to offer. The pulse-pounding shredder set piece, the heart-wrenching incinerator sequence, the emotionally devastating ending, and then finally taking a step back to see how the whole movie thematically ties together, as well as examining what might have been as opposed to what we ultimately got. It's the moment we've been building up to this entire time, the part of the film that moved me more than anything I'd ever seen before as a 7-year-old kid in Auditorium 16 and made me feel every emotion under the sun. Even among an endless catalog of extraordinary brilliant cinematic sequences, the final 30 minutes of Toy Story 3 are genuinely my favorite thing Pixar has ever done, and I cannot wait to finally be able to tell you all about why. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I hope to see you all in 2 weeks for the finest hour of my love letter to Toy Story 3. Goodbye!